Great.
At 40,
Great
you're
movie.
starting to grow up a little.
Good
Like,
morning,
we're-
everyone.
Probably start the meeting. I
We
think that's
should
what Glenn's gonna
probably
do.
start the meeting.
My
Yes.
son's going to be 40 this year.
Oh, wow.
You could be my mom, Teresa.
Yeah, yeah, scary, huh?
All right, it's 9:32, so let's begin. Good morning, everyone. I think I see, yes, we certainly have quorum on the screen. I'll start. I wish to acknowledge that Ottawa is located on unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. Il est important de souligner que la ville d'Ottawa est située sur un territoire non cédé de la nation Algonquin Anishinaabe. I would like to honor the land and the peoples of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation, and whose ancestors have lived on this territory for millennia, and whose culture and presence have nurtured and continue to nurture this land. Melody, can we begin with the roll call, please?
Sure. Councillor Brockington.
Good morning.
Morning. Councillor Cloutier.
Présent.
Councillor Dudas.
Ici.
Councillor Hubley. Councillor Kitts.
Here.
Sorry, thank you.
Here.
Thank you. Councillor Leeper.
Good morning.
Councillor Menard.
Here.
Councillor Suds. Councillor Tierney.
Present.
Councillor El-Shantiri.
Present.
Chair Moffat.
Here.
Chair Gower.
Here.
You have a quorum.
Thank you. And Councillor Suds has sent her regrets this morning. Before we get going, I would like to just say off the top, thank you to Melody. This is Melody's last day as our committee coordinator. She'll be heading to Nova Scotia soon. And Melody, for anyone watching, I think all of our councillors and staff realize the work that committee coordinators like Melody do to put our meetings together. But for residents and other people who are watching, Melody is really the person who connects residents, applicants, stakeholders with committee members. Any email that you send to this committee, Melody makes sure that it gets into the hands of councillors to review. So that's thousands and thousands of emails over the past 6 years since you've been committee coordinator. That's thousands of delegates who've appeared at committee, countless motions and hours of meeting. And it's really Melody who helps bring this all together. I also want to point out Melody was instrumental in making sure that we were able to continue meeting as a committee, planning committee last year at the start of the pandemic. This is the first committee that met remotely by Zoom during the pandemic and really set the stage for a lot of our other city business that happened after that. And that was thanks to Melody's leadership and work to pull that together with her team. So thank you, Melody. We've, yes, a bit of a round of applause for Melody, well deserved. And we've got a shorter meeting today to send you off. So hopefully we won't put too much stress or last minute motions on you for your last committee meeting. But anyway, all of your work's been very much appreciated, and I've appreciated your help and advice over the past few years as well. So thank you.
Thank you.
Are there any declarations of interest? Seeing none. Confirmation of minutes, the minutes for meeting number 47 on August 26th. So the minutes confirmed?
Confirmed.
Confirmed, thank you. So we have a number of items on the agenda. What we'll do is we'll go through on our as a consent agenda.
Chair?
And yes.
If you would please read the opening statement.
Oh, did I forget the opening statement? I did.
Don't
Thank
go,
you.
Melody. Don't go. We'll be over the cliff.
This is a public meeting to consider the proposed comprehensive official plan and zoning bylaw amendments listed at items 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 7 on today's agenda. For the items mentioned, only those who make oral submissions today or written submissions before the amendments are adopted may appeal the matter to the Ontario Land Tribunal. In addition, the applicant may appeal the matter to the Ontario Land Tribunal if council does not adopt an amendment within 90 days of receipt of the application for zoning and 120 days for an official plan amendment. To submit written comments on these amendments prior to their consideration by City Council on September 8th, please email or call the committee or council coordinator. So we're going to go through each of the items on the agenda and determine whether or not any will be held or if any can be carried. The first item is 6101 Renault Road, which is in Innis Ward. There are delegations registered, so we're going to hold this item. On item number 2, it's the official plan and zoning bylaw amendment on Armstrong Street and Wellington Street West in Kitchissippi. There are also delegations registered for this item, so we will hold that item. Item number 3 is a zoning bylaw amendment for part of 2065 Portobello Boulevard in Cumberland Ward, and Councillor Kitts has a motion to defer. Councillor, can you introduce that once it's on the screen?
Yes, if I got part of my computer frozen here, so I'll okay, so I'll just perhaps read the therefore be it resolved. I've requested that the meeting be deferred just to allow additional time to continue discussions on the remainder of the lands. This was part of 2065 Portobello Boulevard. There's another part. So thank you to staff and also to the applicant for agreeing to the deferral. So therefore be it resolved that Planning Committee defer the report until the September 23rd, 2021 regular meeting of Planning Committee, and be it further resolved that there be no further notice pursuant to subsection 3417 of the Planning Act.
Okay, on deferral, is it carried?
Carried.
Carried.
Carried. So we'll be considering that at our next meeting on September 23rd. Item number 4 is a zoning bylaw amendment for 521 Brigantine Avenue and 501 Camden Street here in Stittsville. We don't have any delegations registered. If the committee is ready to carry this, does the applicant need to speak, or would the applicant like to speak on this item?
No, we do not need to speak. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Julie. So are the report recommendations carried?
Carried.
Carried.
Carried. Okay. Item number 5 is a zoning bylaw amendment for 4800 Bank Street in Gloucester, South Nepean. We have no delegations registered. We do have an applicant registered. If the committee is ready to carry this, does the applicant wish to speak?
No.
Okay, thank you. Are the report recommendations carried?
Carried.
Carried. Okay. Item number 6, actually, item number 6 and item number 7 are really on the same item, 406 Bank Street. Number 6 is a application for new construction for 406 Bank Street, a property designated under Part 5 of the Ontario Heritage Act. And item number 7 is a zoning bylaw amendment for 406 and 408 Bank Street. We have no delegations registered. We do have representatives from the applicant registered to speak. If the committee is prepared to carry this, does the applicant need to speak?
No, we do not. Thank you.
Okay, well.
Sorry, Chair, can I just interrupt? Somebody's not unmuted there, or someone is not muted, and I'm getting a lot of background noise there.
Okay. Thank you, Councilor. Okay, we're going to take these one by one. So on item number 6, application for new construction at 406 Bank Street, property designated under Part 5 of the Ontario Heritage Act, are the report recommendations carried?
Carried.
And on number 7, zoning bylaw amendment 406 and 408 Bank Street, are the report recommendations carried?
Carried.
Okay, so that's, we've gone through the agenda, so we'll go back to the beginning. The first item that we held was item number 1, zoning bylaw amendment for 6101 Renault Road and 2980, 3000, 3048, 3054, and 3080 Navan Road in Innis Ward. Councillor Moffat has a motion to replace the report with the revised version. Councillor Moffat, Chair Moffat.
Yeah, thank you very much. So whereas report ACS 2021 PIE PS 0117 recommends approval of a zoning amendment to permit a residential subdivision consisting of 150 townhouse dwellings, 23 single detached dwellings, and a mid-rise condominium block at 6101 Renault Road in 2980, 3000, 3048, 3054, 3080 Navin Road. And whereas an out-of-date version of the report in document 2 details recommended zoning was published, therefore be it resolved that Planning Committee 1 replace report ACS 2021 PIE PS 0117 with ACS 2021 PIE PS 0117 revised, attached to this motion, which includes the following changes. And then there's all the changes in front of you, which I could read, but I'm not sure if there's need to. Therefore, be it further resolved that there be no further notice pursuant to subsection 3417 of the Planning Act.
Okay. Thank you, Chair Moffat. Since we're replacing the report, maybe we should consider this before we get into delegations. Is that motion from Chair Moffat carried?
Carried.
Carried. Thank you. Okay,
Chair,
so,
I'm just wondering, I'm just looking in the file for the revised report in the S drive. I'm using the S drive. When will it be uploaded, or are we getting it in email or?
Should be there now, but I'll check with my team to make sure you do.
Thank you so much.
okay. We're going to start with a staff presentation to give us an overview of what's in front of us. I'm not sure who's making that presentation from staff. Is that Jeff or?
I believe that it's a vote.
Yeah, it's me.
A vote.
Yes.
Good.
We'll just go to slide number 5 directly. So I'll just go through the planning rationale, probably give an overall idea of what's proposed and what the recommendation is. So the subject zoning bylaw amendment is intended to permit the development of a draft plan of subdivision comprised of 150 townhouse dwellings, 23 single detached dwellings, and a mid-rise condominium apartment block. The residential third density subzone YY with exception R3YY zoning is proposed for the detached and townhouse dwellings. The R3 zone permits a range of unit types, including but not limited to detached, semi-detached, duplex, 3-unit, and townhouse dwellings. The YY subzone is commonly used to ensure efficient compact development patterns that maximize the use of land. While the proposed exception XX1 and XX2 contains that specific provisions that will accommodate the owner's housing product design. There's also the residential fifth density subzone N with exception, height suffix of 20 meters. This zone is proposed for apartment dwelling units in a future mid-rise building format limited to 6 stories. The R5N zone allows a wide range of residential building forms, from detached dwelling to high-rise apartment buildings. The proposed exception accommodates a select few non-residential uses limited in floor area and location on the ground floor of an apartment building. It also provides alternative development provisions for back-to-back townhouses, and townhouses served by rear lanes should be proposed with mid-rise apartment use, not to be pursued by the property owner. Yeah, I think that's what maybe I can say for now. I don't know if there's any question.
Okay, thank you, Avod. So we'll come back to staff for questions at the end of this item. We do have representatives from the applicant do you wish to make a presentation for the committee? I think we have Nico Church from FOTEN and Julie Carrera.
Morning, Chair, members of the committee. We are available to make a presentation if you'd like. Policies and regulations. Otherwise, we're happy to just answer any questions.
Julie, your microphone has got a lot of interference on it. It's very difficult to hear you with that.
Sorry, I'll try and fix that. Would you like a presentation?
Well, I'll look to the committee. I'm seeing a couple heads shaking, but perhaps Julie would be best if you could check your microphone or see if you could resolve that. We'll come back to you after our public delegations, and if committee has questions, we can come to you at that time. We have 2 public delegations registered today. We have Krista Curtis and we have Heather Buchanan. Krista, are you with us this morning?
She may be just coming in. Give us 1 second. She's there.
Are we talking to me or Krista?
Krista. Good morning, Krista.
No, I'm Heather, so I'm looking for Krista. I'm not sure if she's here yet.
Okay, well, we can see Krista on our list. So Krista, if you're with us, you're first on our speaking list this morning. Krista, you may need to accept the prompt to unmute.
Yes. Is it actually possible for Heather to speak first? That would make more sense.
I'm okay with that, absolutely. Heather, if you'd like to go first, and we'll go to Chris the second.
Okay, that sounds good. Melody, you have a PowerPoint presentation that I sent?
Just coming up.
Thank you. I'm thinking that this is the earlier version, so I may have to skip through some things to make it fit. I'd like to just say thank you for giving us time to present on behalf of Bradley Estates Community Association. So I'm representing that association today, and because we are impacted by the Kaivan subdivision, just want to touch on some points. The first point is, once the studies were done, it was clear that it was indicated that the boundary street designs did not meet the MMCOS targets whatsoever in terms of pedestrian and bicycle safety. Navin Road, Renault, and Paget, which border the subject lands, are not lit, don't have sidewalks, are not safe, are heavily trafficked, and so on. Next slide, please. So the city, notices that this is the case, but their remarks are noted. Staff are aware of the strain on municipal infrastructure throughout the Orleans South area and will continue to monitor it. To promise that changes will be made post 2031 is not going to improve the safety on those roads at the Kaivan site, nor will it help any of the current residents in the area. So we can't wait another, we've waited 20 years, now we got to wait another 10, I guess, according to the city. And that's one of our reasons for saying that Kaivan should not go forward at this point. Next slide, please. Kaivan is indicated here on this map that I created quickly. So the subject lands, you can see where they are in relation to all of the other developments that are going on. We're talking about 20,000 units that are being built over the next few years, Kaivan being one of them. No changes whatsoever have been made to the surrounding infrastructure, and none are planned for yet post 2031. Next slide, please. I'll skip that slide. Basically then, I've already indicated this, so I will just touch on it, that right now, because we still have no efficient bus connections, including Kaivan, to the closest LRT station, no BRT is slated until post 2031. There's still no safe walking along any of those routes. None of these things have been addressed, and our big concern is that until some changes are made to this infrastructure, nothing like Kaivan or any of the other infills that are being approved daily should be going forward. Next slide, please. The realignment of Renault to connect to Anderson Road would meet the obvious needs of the Orleans communities, including the new Kaivan development. And as such, we really are insisting that this be put in place and connected before we keep approving one subdivision after another. Next slide, please. So one of the justifications for Kaivan being located where it is that they say they're close to the BRT. The BRT is not, doesn't exist. So what they're close to is a park and ride. They will be relying on their cars the same as all of the Orleans South residents do at this point, using these routes indicated on the map. And that map shows Renault and Navin, Mer Bleu, and Innis, all overburdened, all heading to that Walkley employment node. 75% of cars head that way. Next slide, please. Here's the Kaivan subdivision showing the boundary roads and the local infrastructure. The two red dots show where the bus stops are right now. When I last talked, when Kaivan was presenting to our group, they were insisting that all of the residents would use that little red path to come and go to get the bus. 1 minute, sorry.
Yes.
Planners would have you think that nobody's going to cross Navin Road, travel up Paget, that no one's going to be using any of these sites. The next slide shows you, in fact, go to the next one, sorry, that people do. And this is where they'll catch the bus, and this is what it's like to cross the road. Next slide, please. These are the buses that serve the area. 2 milk runs and 1 228 that travels 3 times in the morning, only peak hours, that's it. This is what Kaivan people can expect, yet they're going to promote that they're connected to and are part of a 15-minute community. Next slide, please. I'm going to really rush here. That's where Kaivan's located, way down here where it says Renault Navin. That's the closest store. Next slide, please. Traffic, next slide. Next slide. Next slide, please. All right. Talking about a 15-minute neighborhood, I'm going to run out of time. You all can read through this. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Heather. There is at least one question for you from Councillor Dudas.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Heather. And it may allow you to elaborate a little bit more on the end of your presentation. You had spoken about the traffic, the BRT. What I did want you to just explain a little bit to my colleagues about the proximity to amenities, whether it's food or any of that. So if you could just share a little bit, I know you kind of briefly showed that, but if you can tell people how far it is going to be for people who move into this development and for you and your community to access any of these and how you can actually get there.
Okay, thank you. I don't know whether Melody can show that slide again. It might help to put when I explain things. The one that had it would be back a few, Melody. Right there. Oh, back one. There you go. Thank you. So right now, Kaivan, so the Kaivan unit's going in where that Renault Navin corner is located. If you were to walk to the closest grocery store, that would be the Sobeys, and that's indicating a 54-minute walk. That walk would take you along roads, many of which do not have sidewalks. The expectation that this community, sorry, let me go back to what I wanted to phrase. If you were to drive a car there, you cannot travel north and south. There is no north-south connection to Innis Road. So you have to, because of Paget being cut off. So people have to travel up Renault or up Brian Coburn and then up Mer Bleu to access the Innis commercial area. And so nothing is easily accessible. So in the immediate area where Kaivan's going to be located, there are no grocery stores, no gas stations, no corner stores. There's absolutely no commercial whatsoever. The other little map indicates where the grocery stores rather are located. What it means for people who are buying in Kaivan is that they can't get on a bus and actually get there efficiently to go get groceries, if that's what they're proposing. They'll have to walk or they can drive, but nothing is within easy access for them. The other thing is that Navin Road and parts of Renault and parts of Paget have no sidewalks and have no safe manner of, of either cycling or walking. And that is the expectation. That needs to be rectified, but that is how people are going to be accessing any of the commercial areas around us.
Heather, I have one more quick question for you, and I just really think it would put some things into perspective. We're talking about a new development. We're talking about having that potentially approved today.
Yeah.
But how long have you lived in this community? And I really like you to speak to that, because I think it would really elaborate on the fact of how long everybody in this community has been waiting for simple things like sidewalks and road infrastructure and amenities. So how long have you been living there?
So I'm coming up to 15 years living in Bradley Estates. And at the end of my PowerPoint presentation, which you will all have access to go through at your own leisure, I just took a couple of videos the other day just to show what kind of daily traffic and what kinds of daily conditions exist. Watched young kids trying to rip across the road on Navin because they want to travel up Paget to get to the multi-use pathways, but you can't cross there at that flashing yellow light safely with hundreds of trucks going by. I've taken videos of young kids, mums and kids trying to cross Navin to get that bus and standing there in the ditch waiting to get somewhere along that road on a bus, which is no sidewalks for 15 years. 15 years, development has occurred all through the area. And not one infrastructure change has actually taken place, aside from repaving Renault Road, which is a farm road serving as a major urban thoroughfare now, bisecting communities. So adding Kaivan to the mix is we're adding another, if the condominium goes in at the corner, we're talking 357 units. Those people are not going to be able to rely on bus service, because bus service all has to be routed through the gridlock roads. They're all trying to use Innis and they're all or they're using Renault, and traffic is jammed. And we've got 20,000 units coming from Avalon this way. And we've got everything that's being built east of Merbleu traveling on those same roads. If this was Canada, there'd be 4-lane roads. It's not Canada. Orleans, in particular Orleans South, the infrastructure has been obscenely poor. And it's shocking to us that, let's say a subdivision like Kaivan gets approved, it doesn't fit any of the official plan directives. It's not a 15-minute community. There is no sustainable modes of transportation in and out. There's no commercial, there's no safe walking. How is that allowed? Why do we approve a subdivision which fails on all those levels? It's a question that you guys should ask yourselves. Would you want to live in a community like that? Would you want your kids catching a bus like that on the side of the road in a ditch? Like, this makes no sense. 15 years that we're looking at this. And I'm not for Laura Duda not trying. She pitches this and she's complained about this, and she's written her thoughts on this Kaivan report outlining how she does not approve it. And I don't know how she can convince the rest of you guys to come out and look for yourselves or see what it's like to just keep adding one subdivision after another with no infrastructure to support it. Our quality of life should matter.
Thank you, Heather, for coming. I think it's important that everybody hears the situation as it is from somebody who lives there. Anyway, that's enough for me. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Heather. Krista Curtis is our next speaker.
Hello, everybody. So my name is Krista. I'm not quite as a long-term resident as Heather. I've been here for 8 years. moved when my son was just born, graduated from the NICU, and my daughter was 2. We were really excited to move into the community, hopeful for our daughter and son to start school in the community. Unfortunately, my daughter just started grade 5 in French school. No English school has been built in the community. Still busily holding our breath like the rest of the community, waiting for some infrastructure and amenities to be built there. Also waiting for some answers about when these things will arrive. During the community meeting with the Kaivan developer actually laughed when someone asked what would happen to the land if the development wasn't approved. I hope that this was recorded. It was pretty classless behavior by the developer. It also made me think about what this meant for us as a community. It made me reflect on how our interests were being taken care of by the city. What does this mean for us? Is that how the city is taking care of us? Does that mean that our interests are not being taken seriously? Our community wrote 75 comments to the city. The responses by the city were shameful. The comments stated that the subdivision would be completely out of place in our community. And the city responded that it was okay because this land was slated for residential subdivision purposes. Another concern stated that there was no inclusive or affordable housing planned, and the developer responded that was correct, there was none. Another comment stated that the proposed lot sizes were small and cramped. The city assured us that the developer had proposed other similarly small and cramped lot sizes throughout the city. I'm not sure how that was supposed to be comforting. These comments were as helpful as someone telling me that they like buttermilk and that leaves fall down from the trees and fall. You're filling our neighborhoods with eyesores because you can, and there are no affordable housing because you don't feel like it. You're going against the official plan that you developed, which says that all new housing developments should contain 25% of affordable housing, and you're going against it. This doesn't meet the plans laid out in the East Urban Community Design Plan. I'm not sure what the role of a city planner is if it's not planning a city where people live. So I will tell you things that you already know. We have no need for this development. It doesn't belong here. We have no infrastructure for it. We have no buses to move the people who will live in it. We have no schools for the children who will live here. We have no jobs for the people who will move into it. We have no stores for the people who will shop there. We have no gas stations, no garages. We have no sidewalks, no room on the roads. We have no restaurants for the people to eat in. Our community needs more than houses to be a community. To the city planners, I wonder if you knew when you took this job that you would be forced to attend meetings and listen to people like me who dreamed of moving into a neighborhood and having a place to raise their children and celebrate accomplishments and spend hard times and share sadness, such as those during the past 2 years. Did you think that you would walk away from the meetings and knowing that none of these comments matter and use the only stamp that you were issued, the approve stamp, and stamp it on the documents and walk away? I hope that while you're listening today, you will actually have the courage to use a different stamp, the one that says to not approve this development. I hope that you will hear the voices of the community instead of the money that is crinkling in the pockets of the developers.
Thank you, Krista, for your presentation. Are there any questions from committee members? I'm seeing none on this. So thank you, Krista, and thank you again, Heather, for your presentations. We'll move now to questions for the applicant. Registered from the applicant, we have Nico Church and Julie Carrera from FOTEN, and Hugo Lalonde and May Pham from Kaivan, who are available to answer questions. Are there any questions for the applicant? Councillor Menard.
Thanks, Chair. I noted a few points around affordable housing, and I guess I'll just ask the applicant first why they don't feel that there's a need for affordable housing in this plan.
So good morning, everyone. My name is Julie Crair. I'm a planner at Pro10 Consultants. So I don't think there's any, I think we're all in agreement that there is a need for more affordable housing in the city. This subdivision proposes 3 different types of units that range in size and therefore range in price. We have detached units, townhouse.
Sorry, Chair, there's a bit of feedback. I'm just having a bit of trouble following. I'm not sure. Is that on my end only, or?
No, it is. It's a little better than before, Julie, in terms of your microphone, but it's still like a buzz, some interference on your mic, unfortunately.
Okay, I could pass it over to a colleague if you'd like.
I can still kind of hear, but it's, yeah, sorry.
Okay. I was just would like to go through our presentation as well, because there were a lot of questions that just came up that I think will be addressed through our presentation.
Well, if one of your colleagues could answer Councilor Menard, it is difficult to hear you. Let's go with that.
I'm happy to speak to it, Chair. So just jumping on what my colleague Julie said, we can certainly agree that there is a need for more affordable housing throughout the city. In terms of this particular development, housing that is below market rate is not proposed. That being said, in terms of providing more supply to the city, we're hoping that this will help the current housing crisis, where there's quite an issue with not enough supply that is not meeting the demand that is presently there.
Okay, thanks for that. And I guess my next question would just be around some of the infrastructure concerns that are being raised. The last thing I want to see is more car-centric communities being built in Ottawa, because it costs us a heck of a lot of money, and costs us also in terms of the environment and our sustainability goals. So it's not where we're headed. And this one seems to be that way. The only thing I'm seeing in terms of infrastructure updates in the near future is that there's a TMP for a road widening potential. But heard the delegates talk very clearly about the need for transit, for walkability, cycling infrastructure. So I just wonder what your take is on that, and what responsibility you may see in also building that type of 15-minute community that delegations were talking about.
So I'm just going to try one last time. I've changed my input for my speaker. Still bad?
It's still interfering.
Can you hear me though?
We can hear you. I think soldier on.
Yeah.
We can hear you, but it's just a difficult listen.
I just want to touch on a few things because I was involved in the EUC phase 3 area CDP just to the northeast of here. So I just wanted to add that input, and then I can turn it over to Nico. So there is the planned Cumberland bus rapid transit route that is planned to cut across South Orleans, with a station to the immediate north of this site, within 100 meters of the north end of the site. It is currently scheduled for post 2031, but as we all know, the transportation master plan is in the process of being updated. So I'm not sure if there'll be any change to that date when that moves forward. But we are very close to that planned station, which has a new park and ride that was just recently developed the other year. Our concept plan in the draft approved subdivision has a sidewalk leading directly north up to the roundabout at Brian Coburn and Navin Road that would provide access to that bus rapid transit station. And in the meantime, it is a bus stop. There is bus service along Navin Road, and Kaivan has committed to providing a sidewalk to a bus stop along there. Within the subdivision itself, there are also sidewalks. There's pedestrian connections planned to the existing community to the west. There's 2 connections along there as well. So there is planned infrastructure. Unfortunately, it's not immediately there. In terms of connection to the wider community and the 15-minute community, Paget Road, I don't know, maybe we could put up our slides eventually, but Paget Road is a north-south collector that heads up to Innis, which, as most people know, is where a lot of the commercial retail is in Orleans, in South Orleans, including a grocery store. And there is a sidewalk, not south of the BRT corridor, but north of the corridor. There's a sidewalk leading up to Innis. Some of the other things I want to mention for that EUC Phase 3 area CDP, there is a couple planned collector roads that will connect people, pedestrians, cyclists, and vehicles as well up to Innis Road where the current water tower is. So while there may not be a direct vehicular connection up right now, there is one planned for that CDP that was just approved earlier this year. And in terms of I just wanted to address, actually, I'll see if there's any other questions before I continue.
Well, Julie, I'll pause because I made an error as chair. I did give you the opportunity at the beginning to spend some time to address the technical issues, and I think we didn't give you a full opportunity to present. So I will give you a couple minutes. If there's any other points that you wanted to address before we continue with questions from councillors, I'll give you the opportunity to do that.
That would be great. If Melody, if you could put up our slides. And go to the second slide, please. So this is an outline of the subject lands. Paget Road, which I mentioned, is along the eastern edge. It's a collector road that heads up to Innis, although it has been, to get over the BRD corridor, it's only pedestrians and cyclists. A vehicle cannot travel all the way up. We have Renault Road along the southern edge, which is also a collector. And then we have Navin Road along the northern edge, which is an arterial road. Go to the next slide. So this subdivision is designated general urban area in the official plan, which is primarily a residential designation, but it does allow for supporting uses. So the building heights in this area are generally low rise. However, greater heights and density are encouraged along arterial roads such as Navin and within proximity to transit, such as we are with the BRT station plan to the immediate north. Next slide, please. So this is the CDP for the area, which is from 2005. As you'll see on the following slides, the proposed local road network through this site is generally what is shown in the approved draft plan of subdivision. And the designation was medium low density development. Since 2005, our target densities have increased over time. So we are exceeding that target. Next slide, please. The lands are currently zoned development reserve, which indicates that they are planned for future development. As we've already heard from the delegations, there are existing homes to the west and to the south. And there are a couple of parcels that are undeveloped, but are zoned to permit a range of uses in the future, including commercial, such as a block zone general mixed use to the north and a block zone local commercial to the southeast. So that is the planned context. However, those two potential commercial blocks, which could also allow residential, have not yet been developed. Next slide, please. This is the concept plan that reflects the draft approved plan of subdivision. You can see that sidewalk going up the western side of Falsetto, which is the western north-south street. That will then connect pedestrians and cyclists up to the roundabout and up to the BRT station. And the orange block in the southeast corner is the mid-rise apartment block that is proposed, which again is right immediately adjacent to an arterial road and a collector road, is within 5 to 10 minute walking distance of the planned BRT. And then everything in light orange is proposed to be townhomes, and yellow is proposed to be detached units. And the red block along Renault is an existing home that will remain. Next slide, please. This is the draft plan of subdivision that reflects the concept plan. It was approved. It has passed the appeal period, so it's in effect. Next slide, please. I believe Evode went through all this. These are the proposed zones. So all the singles and towns are proposed to be R3YY. The condo block is proposed to be R5, which is the first zone that allows for a mid-rise apartment building, but capped at 6 stories. And then there are a couple of parcels that will remain development reserve. And then it's just questions after that. So we don't need to go any further, but I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Okay, thank you, Julie. Councillor Kitts has a question.
Thank you, Chair. We heard some concerns from the community today, and obviously there was a lot of comments submitted, and I didn't have any questions for the delegations, but I appreciate their frustrations. I'm the neighboring ward councillor, and I'm very aware of the infrastructure problems in this area. Has this application evolved in any way to respond to any of the concerns that you've heard from the community?
I can point out a couple of changes that occurred. Perhaps we could go back to the concept plan, which is on slide 6. So originally there was a planned vehicular connection to the west, to where the existing homes are, and there was concern from residents that there may be cut through traffic. So this was converted to a multi-use pathway block so that pedestrians and cyclists could connect to the community to the west, which does have a park, without vehicles traveling that way, so that vehicles will be directed up to Navin Road and down to Renault. And that's the key, one of the key changes. I'm not sure if anyone else on the team can think of another one. Perhaps not. But we tried to maintain, as I showed in the CDP plan, the road network that was originally envisioned for the site. You can see it almost perfectly aligns with some additional roads where some existing residential is now planned to be part of the subdivision.
Okay, so not too many changes then. I'm also, in response to Councillor Menard's question, you talked at length about the BRT. Are you aware of the NCC's position with respect to option 7 and the city's plan with respect to that BRT? Are you aware that the NCC has said that they will not allow us to build that BRT in the location that we have planned?
Yes, we are aware that there is that disagreement in the alignment of the extension further west.
Okay, so I think, with that in mind, the concerns of the community are very real, because it's not only, out 2031 and beyond, it's at this point, we don't have a way forward with the BRT, which really exasperates the situation. I'm wondering as well, we heard about amenities in this area. You have the mid-rise block. Did you consider putting commercial at the ground floor?
Yes, so the proposed zoning, which is R5 with exceptions, does allow for it adds a convenience store and a daycare as additional permitted uses in the event that there is when that block goes ahead. It will have to go through a separate site plan control process. But at that time, if there's interest to add that from the developer, then our proposed zoning would allow for at least a convenience store.
Okay, that's good. Those are all my questions. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Leeper.
Thanks, Chair. I'm just wondering, can you take us through, please, again, the pedestrian access to bus stops? I'm looking at some roads that are, fairly rural in their nature. How are people safely going to cross to bus stops on Navin and on Renault?
Wondering if perhaps Kaivan could speak to the planned sidewalk connection to one of the bus stops there.
Yeah, we have Hugo Lalonde and May Pham who are with
us. Good morning, co-chairs and members of committee. I'm Hugo Lalone, Director of Planning or Development rather at Kaiven, and I have Mei Pham with me, a project manager on this project. So, you know, we have implemented some sidewalk and some walkability measures into our plan. We have a connection that's proposed to the roundabout at Navan and Brian Coburn, where the park and ride facility is located. So that is one measure. We also have a sidewalk connection to Renault Road to the south, where there's an existing bus stop. That would be a second connection. We've also advanced and proposed a sidewalk connection from our most eastern access to Navan Road from Falsetto along Navan and to a bus stop that's existing on Paget. So we have done those three things throughout the course of the development, working with staff. We believe that, you know, these are the measures that are within our reach and our realm in terms of our ability to propose tangible solutions. A lot of the concerns that were raised today, you know, we are certainly sympathetic to them, and we want to work with staff and with the councillor, and we have been engaging deeply with the community association as well as with Councillor Dudas to, you know, discuss some of these issues. At the end of the day, we do not have a planning compliance or conformity issue. You know, the land use that is proposed is exactly what's called for in the CDP. And so, you know, what we are left with is some legacy transportation issues that need to be resolved with the city. And, you know, we're happy to participate in that.
Are there, so on Renault, there's a number of bus stops. Are there safe crossings being contemplated at this point?
Thank you for your question. And through co-chairs, no, we are not proposing any pedestrian crossings on Renault. There is a stop sign further east on Renault coming out of the Bradley Estate subdivision. And then there is also controlled signalized access at the intersection of Renault and Navan further east.
It's yeah, there's some significant distances. I mean, I guess I would be looking for the developer to assist the councillor on this one with creating some of those crossings, because this is, it's kind of stranded in the middle of a bunch of very large roads, and while the pedestrian access to get to Renault, Navan seems good, crossing them so that you can catch a bus going the other way seems problematic, unless I've misunderstood the proposal. Where is the potential for walkable retail in this area?
Thank you, Councillor, and through co-chairs. As noted in the presentation, we have a future development block within our community for a future condominium building. The proposed zoning provisions would allow for ground floor retail uses as well as a daycare. A convenience store could be permitted within the ground floor of that future building. As also noted, there's the local commercial zone already zoned to the southeast, as well as a general mixed use zone just to the north in that current woodlot that's just south of Brian Coburn. So those would be two immediate opportunities in addition to the permitted uses that we are, you know, voluntarily proposing and carrying forward with our zoning request.
It's okay. It's very car centric. Very, very car centric. All right, I'll yield my time. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Dudas.
My colleagues mentioned a lot of points that I wanted to bring up, and I think it's the focus is certainly on the fact that this is a very car-centric development in a very car-centric community. But I do want to get back to something you just said. You know, Hugo, you and I have had lots of conversations alongside with the community association that you referenced that in the condo block, there may be the opportunity for some amenities, a convenience store, a daycare, but you keep using the word future. And I'm going to go back to the question that I asked one of the residents that she's been living there for 15 years and hasn't seen any development in terms of amenities close by. So can you put a date on, and once again, it's not that I'm going to hold you to it. I know that's still, but when you say future, are you talking another 15 years? Are you talking 5? Are you talking like sooner than that? Because I think, you know, once again, there is solutions to this community's problems. And some of it is introducing amenities that they can walk to, so they don't always have to get in their car. So do you have any kind of concept as to what that future might be in terms of time?
Yes, thank you for your question, Councillor, and through you, co-chairs. I did reference to a future development block for that condo building. I think the timing for that would be that we could quite certainly see a site plan application come through within the next 12 months and, you know, have a completed building within the next 3 to 5 years. So I don't think that the timing is a 15-year horizon, as, you know, may have been suggested by some delegations, or perhaps as the question was raised, but no, certainly a short time frame.
And, you know, as I said before, I'd really ask any developer that is coming into this community to consider incorporating some elements of commercial. That would go a long way to addressing at least some of these issues. But I do appreciate that, and I very much appreciate my colleagues' questions on this matter. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Councillor Dudas. I'm seeing no more questions for the applicant. So let's move on to questions for staff. Councillor Brockington.
Thank you, Chair. So first of all, I want to be 100% sure, as per the motion, we're talking about a proposal for 156 townhouses and 23 single detached dwellings. Is that the total number of units that's being proposed via this application?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. So it's a small proposal in the grand scheme of things when you look at sort of the east end of the city, Orleans, or this part of Innis, but I don't want to discount at all the concerns that we heard from the public. The disconnect between planning applications and lack of infrastructure, city infrastructure, which is a city responsibility, is quite stark across the city, not just in the East End. We certainly had this debate at when the Taggart proposal was on the floor at Riverside and Hunt Club. We talked about the South End development, how this intersection was a constant failure, and we were just adding gas to the fire. Again, it was a small development in the grand scheme of things, but we were just adding more and more and more. So I want to hear from the city. What is the transportation and infrastructure plan in the east end of town, in this particular area, but in the east end of town? We continuously hear that it's inadequate, that it's insufficient, and yet we continue to approve applications without a light at the end of the tunnel for infrastructure to keep pace with these developments. So what is the plan?
Mr. McEwen will respond to that, chairs. Certainly, you know, this development is within keeping with the CDP, and over time the infrastructure will catch up. Certainly, I'll have Mr. McEwen speak to the transportation in this area. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I do appreciate the frustration that the community has with this lack of infrastructure. And I do also agree that it is a city responsibility to prioritize the delivery of this. And it is a CDP. These are development charge projects, and so they are put on the development charge list. And unfortunately, these are at the moment of the post 2031 time horizon. So, and we're going through a new infrastructure master plan, a new transportation master plan. Maybe this is something that we need to address through these new studies.
Okay, obviously the local councillors know this neck of the woods much better than I do, but it's a tired refrain across the city, and I don't believe it's exaggerated. The pictures speak for themselves, but I really do want to see the TMP be very clear in how we're going to keep pace with the development charges. This application on planning merits is sound. On planning merits, we should approve this. but the community has very legitimate concerns about the quality of life, how people function in this community, and this development contributes to the existing challenges. And so I think they deserve answers, and the committee as a whole deserve answers as well. So that's the frustration. I will yield to the local councillors to hear their views, but that's the frustration is from the planning side, it's reasonable, but we shouldn't be approving planning applications without looking at the bigger picture. And that's what's causing the community those concerns. So thank you, chairs.
Okay, Councillor Leeper.
Thanks. Similar to Councillor Brockington, I mean, this question of the density and coming before the infrastructure is in place is actually quite relevant to all of us. There are in downtown areas significant intensification taking place without some of the transportation and parks and recreation infrastructure being in place to meet those new residents. I guess I've got three questions. The first of which is how are DCs that are collected from this project, where will those go? I'm guessing they will go into reserve funds, but can someone just spell that out more explicitly for me?
Yes, Chair. The DCs collected from this area go into the citywide funds.
Okay.
And then the citywide funds would then be used in this area as well to finance these DC projects.
So are these DCs going to be put against already identified projects?
Yes.
But we are building up those, building up the reserves to trigger and then build the infrastructure when the cash is there?
Yes, Chair. The DCs are put towards all the items that are identified within the background study and the development charges bylaw.
And so the projects that residents are talking about here with respect to the transportation infrastructure have been identified as projects that are currently accruing reserve funds through the DCs?
Chair, I would not be able to verify that their specific concerns are in fact identified. I think some of these projects are beyond the 2031 horizon, so they may not be actually identified as a project in that background study.
I think your guess is right, and that's my assumption as well, is that the projects are not necessarily identified yet, which means that funds are not accruing toward them, despite bringing in the DCs. So the TMP obviously is going to be critical in order to identify those projects and begin that process of collecting the charges against them. Another question, and this one might be for Mr. Mark, is in terms of where this process goes if council were to refuse the application. The high-level policies, the community design plan, speak to the appropriateness of this kind of built form in this location put toward this use. If council were to refuse the application on the basis of impacts on transportation infrastructure, be that vehicular, pedestrian, transit, to what extent does OLT give us that latitude to try to determine the staging of projects according to whether or not the infrastructure can handle it?
Mr. Chair, when an applicant brings a matter, so upon a refusal, if the applicant appeals that to the Ontario Land Tribunal, the applicant is able to look at in making its case to the tribunal, as indeed the city is in a relevant case, the infrastructure that exists today and the infrastructure that is planned to exist in the future. And the case would have to be made out as to whether or not what is existing and planned is sufficient as the years pass in order to support the application that would be before the tribunal on appeal.
So the roadworks that residents are looking for may be in a post 2031 planning horizon, but are not necessarily identified as projects in the DC background study today, does that give us grounds to refuse the application?
Mr. Chair, if I may just come back 2031, and then I will answer the council's question directly. If the infrastructure, particularly now that we're in 2021, is in the timeframe from 2021 to 2031, then it would be a difficult case to make for the application not to proceed, unless of course it's water or sewer, in which case you have to have that first. If the infrastructure is post 2031, then it's not going to be in the background study, because background study only goes to 2031. And if it was felt essential for the development to proceed, there is a prospect of a defensible case, Mr. Chair.
Okay. Those are my questions. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you. Maybe if I could just clarify a bit on the lines. I appreciate where Councillor Brockington and Councillor Leeper were going with that. The report says that the transportation infrastructure is suitable for what's being proposed here. The current transportation infrastructure is suitable. How close are we to it not being suitable? Like, can you put a number to that? Are we 500 cars a day away? Are we 1,000 cars? Like, how close are we to the point where staff would not be considering new development that depends on some of these road and future bus corridors suitable, I guess?
Mr. Chair, unfortunately, I don't have an answer for you on that question in terms of how far away we are. We reviewed the transportation assessment and found that it was suitable.
Okay, so I guess every future one in this area or sort of downstream from these arterial roads would be considered case by case. That's how you consider it.
Yes.
Maybe I could approach it a different way. So the East Urban Phase 1 CDP was in 2005. Do you know how many homes were contemplated? How many homes or people would be living in the area covered by the CDP once fully built out?
I don't have that number off the top of my head. I'm sorry, Mr. Chair.
Well, maybe I'll pause. I'll come back to this a little later. If someone could check on that, just I'm interested in what's the anticipated housing count in the East Urban CDP, and where are we at so far? How far along in that progression are we? Maybe if someone could check on that, and I'll come back and ask it a little later on. There's a couple other councillors with questions. Councillor Dudas.
You segued nicely into my question, and maybe I can give you some overall comments in respect to where that's going to be. In South Orleans, there's going to be an increase in 15,424 units built as planned developments over this coming 10 years. That's representing about 18% of the greenfield development in the entire city of Ottawa. What I was going to ask city staff, and I'm actually referencing to my esteemed colleague, Councillor Brockington, he's quite right. This is an acceptable amount of development, what we're looking at today. But what I wanted to ask staff was, right now, we're anticipating development by Ashcroft up the street that's going to add several hundred residential homes. Again, no commercial, residential. Down Renault, I have two separate developments I'm looking at that are coming in the next little while that are going to add, a couple of tens of new units. Further along, heading closer to Councillor Kitt's ward, we're looking at a proposal for a 28-story building, potentially series of buildings. There are several other hundreds of houses, thousands of houses that are proposed for Glenview and Ridgecraft in the East Urban Design Community. So my question to staff is, and it's very much aligned with what Chair Gower was saying, is when is enough enough? I would love the day that I could say yes to all of this. I look forward to it. I want our community to absorb it's in the intensification that we're seeing in other areas of the city. But when do the road capacities reach their maximum? When do we realize that the BRT that dead ends even if it was built tomorrow, and I know it takes time, but it dead ends at Navin. It has nowhere to go, even if we did build the connection. When is it that we say that all of these drops in the bucket has caused the bucket to overflow? And when you're looking at a proposal like this one, where it seems very reasonable, and in reality it is under the Planning Act, when do you say we just can't do this anymore and we have to start refusing these applications in this area? Or we have to start building the infrastructure that needs to go in.
Mr. Chair, if I could maybe respond to that, I certainly recognize some of the challenges that these developments pose. And I know I've probably said this before in the past, it's like a chicken and the egg situation where we need the development in order to receive the development charge funds in order to fund these transportation initiatives. And I don't want people to think that there's not a lot of planning that goes in behind these developments that come forward to your committee. So we start with the official plan, and then we've got community design plans, and then we've got an IMP, an infrastructure master plan, and we've got the TMP, as everyone knows. There's broader discussions that we're having here that I think are related to the TMP and the future discussions around the TMP. This particular file meets with the CDP directions and the transportation studies that have been done. I know it can sometimes be a pressure, but I think growth tends to be pressure on communities. But in time, the infrastructure does catch up. And this is important for these developments and the approvals that committee and council makes. If we're not going to approve these developments, you're not going to get the funding that you need to be able to advance the infrastructure that's required moving forward. I hope that helps.
And I understand that, and I've had a lot of very fruitful conversations with staff about this, and I know you're in a bit of a pickle as well. But what is that time? Like you said, in time it catches up. Well, the first shovels went in the ground for this community over 15 years ago. I know that Heather lives in the older part of the community, so we're talking 15 years. And I'm going to throw out one example. And we're talking we're talking roads, we're talking BRTs, we're talking this. I'm going to give you guys a very small example of what has been put on hold because we can't get movement in this area. My predecessor, 2 times removed, Councillor Rayner below us, recognized that there wasn't a sidewalk at the end of Renault connecting to Navin. So a major artery, and there was houses going in ad hoc all over the place. He funded out of whatever, he didn't have a cash or traffic calming measure funding at that time. He funded temporary flex stakes to go up as curbs so that he could provide a temporary sidewalk. That sidewalk's still there. There's no development abutting this section, so I can't get a sidewalk in there. And I've been told that I cannot put up additional flex stakes along Navin because under the Highway Traffic Act, the speeds of 70 plus could cause people to be impaled if they're struck by it. And it's interesting we speak to that because that's where one of those bus stops is. So people are standing on the side of the road in a ditch. And I've said this before, and I don't, I'm sorry to go on about this, but I want to say yes to developments across the board, across the East End. It brings people, it brings growth, it brings money, it brings infrastructure. I want to say yes. And the community is willing to accept these changes. But we're so far behind in terms of infrastructure. I'm asking Leanne, and I'm sorry, I'm using this as an opportunity. I'm getting kind of emotional, but I'm asking Leanne, when does it come time that we catch up to where we need to be? Because we can't start refusing everything that comes across our plates. How is it we get to that point? And it can't be post 2031 in a TMP or 2041. Like, how do we get to that point, and how do we get to it fast?
Yeah, I totally understand that, Councillor. And, I think there's competing priorities that we have and that council has to address. And, affordable housing, we had a big discussion about yesterday. So the more product that we have online with respect to the, residents' ability to purchase a home or to rent an apartment or a condominium, the supply and demand curve starts to kick in with respect to affordable housing. So I know that is one of council's main and key priorities. Infrastructure and transportation infrastructure is another key priority. And I think these are really good discussions to have with our transportation planning folks. Ms. Chi's team with respect to timing around development and timing around these projects that are coming up. So I think it's a really good discussion that I'll take offline with Ms. Chi and have further discussion around timing for some of the challenges that you may be facing in your community.
And I want to thank committee's indulgence in allowing me to wax poetic for a moment. And I will be happily to take these conversations offline. I know we've been having conversations for a long time. We need action. So, but I'm going to leave it at that, Chair. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Kitts.
Thank you, Chair. So question to staff is, the CDP is contingent on the BRT. It's a crucial part of that plan. So what happens to this CDP if we have no foreseeable way forward with the BRT? Because as you know, it's stalled right now with negotiations with the NCC. So what happens to that CDP if that piece is unachievable for the foreseeable future?
Chair, I don't know if Mr. McEwen wanted to add anything to that, but the community design plan and our secondary plans remain as sort of appendices to the primary plan being the official plan. So they still have status. They will continue to have status. And as we've talked about, certainly it's all about funding, right? And it comes down to the money. Show me the money. So from a policy perspective, we still maintain those policies, and as I've mentioned, that development needs to take place in order for us to afford the amenities that go along with creating and developing a community. And those CDPs and secondary plans remain in force and effect.
Okay, I mean, I can understand it's all about the money argument, and I agree with you. We need to continue to develop if we want the DCs to be able to pay for these things. I get that, but in this situation, it's more than just the funding. It's that the NCC is saying you cannot build your plan. So I think it goes beyond, because not only is the BRT not in the affordable network, but even if it was, we wouldn't be able to go forward with it. So that to me is the problem. And I don't have another question, and I'm not the ward councillor, so I won't have a wrap up. But if you'll indulge me, I do have some comments, because that is the fundamental issue here, is that the CDP is counting on a bus rapid transit network that is expected to feed the LRT system, and it is planned to run alongside the Brian Coburn extension to Blair Road. That extension is stalled by the breakdown of negotiations between the city and the NCC for the use of the NCC lands between Chapel Hill South and Blair Road. All of that is not Kaivan's fault. They are pursuing what they are allowed to build here. And as my colleague said, that the planning policies here are sound. But every time an application comes before me, I caution that, it's not the individual application that's the problem. It's that cumulative impact that you just heard Councillor Dudas speak to. And we are aware that we need more housing in this city and that we need to encourage development. I also want to be clear, the CDP is a great plan. I voted in favor of the CDP. I believe Councillor Dudas did as well. But the problem that we're facing in the South Orleans area is that this crucial piece of the CDP is stalled with no resolution in sight. So, we have this application in front of us today, but it's, I guess, a warning to the committee. We're going to keep hearing these concerns until we find a solution. And trust me, the East End councillors are trying. I have asked the NCC, if they are aware that their position is forcing us to continue to create these car-dependent communities. So perhaps as a parting comment, committee members, if anyone wants to come to South Orleans, have an on-the-ground look at what we're facing here, you have an open invitation anytime. Co-Chair Gower's already taken me up on that offer. But we have a real challenge for our communities, and I do appreciate the discussion that has occurred here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Kitts. Chair Moffat is next.
Thanks. I put my hand up just when Councillor Leeper was discussing with Tim Mark, and I just want to jump back into that. Mr. Mark was talking about the rationale that you'd have at an OLT hearing and how you could justify a position. I'm just curious, what weight does the 2013 decision of council to not fund BRT along Innis in this area have? Because it was council's decision that swapped the funding for BRT in this area in favor of LRT along the 174. We made that decision. It was the councillor of the day that pushed for LRT to Orleans as quickly as possible. That ended up being to Plaster Orleans, which eventually was to Trim along the 174, which fronts on no developable area. So if you're actually in front of an OLT and you're arguing in favor of a decision by council that is completely reflective of another decision by council, how does that weigh into the decision or to that defense?
It would not be helpful, Mr. Chair.
Okay, that's all. Thanks.
Councillor Menard.
Thanks very much, Chair. I guess a couple quick comments. One is, I think if councillors in the East End feel that this shouldn't go forward because of a lack of infrastructure, then perhaps a similar situation as what happened in Councillor Gower's ward with a lack of transit feeding into a new development. There's a hold placed in terms of build timelines. And there may need to be more holds placed for build timelines based on infrastructure issues. So if there is, I'd suggest putting something forward, because otherwise, I mean, for me, I think there should be a hold here. I'd vote for that. But without that, the position here around this development, the application itself probably merits approval. It's the surrounding infrastructure that is there and the concerns of the community. So I'll just put that out there. The second thing I'll just mention is, as we expand our city further out, these issues will not stop. So the whole question about sort of how do we catch up by 2031, we're not going to catch up by 2031 or anytime soon, because we keep expanding out. As we do that, infrastructure does not come easy, and it's extremely expensive to put out there. So we have to collectively as a council, if we're concerned about this issue, we need to be concerned about the rapid expansion of our urban boundary over the next couple of decades, because this will come up over and over and over again. So I think some consistency on that, so that we use the infrastructure we have, is appropriate in this case, to mention that. So I hope when the official plan comes up again that these comments are noted. It doesn't just happen that these things occur. We expand and we put them on the periphery, and then these issues arise. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, thank you, Councillor. Are there any other questions from councillors for staff? If not, then maybe we go back to what I was asking about in terms of the East Urban CDP. Was staff able to determine what's the expected number of homes?
So looking at, sorry, Mr. Chair, looking at our website, phase 1 has 3,498 units, which is where this property is located. It's in phase 1. Phase 2 has 1,358 units.
And how far along are we in terms of either units built or units approved to be built already?
Sorry, but in phase 1, it hasn't been completely built out. There's still quite a few subdivisions there. Ashcroft has a lot of land there that's not built out as well. The exact numbers I can't give you at this point.
This is I think a really important discussion. I I don't think we can say the situation in the east, and in particular in this area, is the same as other suburban situations, because there is a significant difference, and that is the roadblock that the NCC has put in our way in terms of our transportation plans. That's a little different problem to solve. You know, in Stittsville, I've got a problem with Robert Grant Avenue, and Councillor Hubley and Councillor Moffat, their wards have the same problem with Robert Grant, but that's entirely in the city's ability to fund and to schedule. And in fact, on that one, we've been able to move up the funding and the scheduling, so we know it'll happen before 2031. In the case of the NCC, as long as we have that roadblock, there is a tremendous amount of uncertainty about when that will be built. This CDP in 2005, when it was created and passed by council, I don't think could contemplate at all that 25, 26 years later in 2031, there might not be the available transportation corridors upon which the planning was based on. So that's a problem. I do think at some point we're going to have to start looking to staff to refuse based on the refuse applications, reject applications based on that uncertainty around the transportation infrastructure. I don't think this is the application to refuse to make that point or to address some of the concerns here today. But I do think that we're going to have to look seriously at future developments in the East End in phase 1, phase 2 of this CDP and others. There's a point where I don't think we can keep justifying. We've heard from staff, they can't give us advice on when we will reach that breaking point from a policy or from a legal standpoint. We're not at the point where we can make a defensible case, I don't think, in terms of the transportation infrastructure, but we must be getting close. And I think there'll be some future applications in the East End where it'll be very hard for us as a committee or as a council to allow these things to keep continuing without that certainty around transportation. We have talked about this issue in terms of the new OP, some of the motions and directions that we've given staff around creating gateway policies to tie development approvals to the funding and construction to transportation. So that's good. Councillor Moffat, Councillor Menard, I appreciate your suggestion around the hold. We were able to achieve that in Stittsville because the developer agreed to the hold. I don't believe we have a grounds where we could impose that and be able to defend that. But through the new OP, we are developing policy and rules that would allow us to do that. And that's good. And it's to address what we're talking about here today, this gap between when people move in and when we have the transportation infrastructure. So I got to be supporting the staff report, fully acknowledging the concerns of the residents and looking towards future applications. And there will be a breaking point where it won't be acceptable to approve these without more certainty around that transportation corridor in the NCC. Are there any other questions or, sorry, I guess we're on comments at this point or wrap up. Anyone else wishing to wrap? Melody, can we do a recorded vote on this, please?
On the item as amended.
On the
Councillor
item
Dudas.
that's amended, yeah.
Thank you. Councillor Dudas.
No.
Councillor Suds. Councillor Tooney.
Yes.
Councillor Leeper.
Yes.
Councillor Brockington.
Yes.
Councillor Menard.
Yes.
Councillor Cloutier.
Oui.
Councillor Kitts.
No.
Councillor Hubley.
Yes.
Councillor El-Shantiri.
Yes.
Chair Moffat.
Yes.
Chair Gower.
Yes.
8 yeas, 2 nays. Or sorry, 7 yeas, 2 nays.
Okay, thank you. So the revised report and recommendations have carried on that one.
Apologize again, Chair. That was 8-2.
8-2. Thank you.
Yes.
Okay, we'll move on to the next item that was held. This was official plan and zoning bylaw amendment for 26, 36, and 40 Armstrong Street, and 961, 967, 969, 973, and 979 Wellington Street West in Kitchissippi. We'll begin with the presentation from the planner. I believe that's Simon Diaco who'll be presenting today.
Yes, thank you, Co-Chair. Good morning, co-chairs, members of the committee and public. I'm the file lead, Simon Diaco, for the applications that are under consideration today, which are for official plan amendments and zoning bylaw amendments to the Wellington Street West and Scott Street secondary plan. Next slide, please. The subject properties comprise of a full city block. The site is approximately 2,900 square meters and is bound by Wellington Street to the south, Armstrong Street to the north, Hilda Street to the east, and Garland Street to the west. It's comprised of specifically 8 properties that Chair Gower took us through. And the property is also located in the Hintonburg neighborhood at the intersection of where Somerset transitions into Wellington Street, just west of the corridor, the Trillium corridor. Next slide, please. Contextually, we see the property at various angles here as we're moving around the site, and the area generally comprises of a mix of low, mid, and high-rise buildings. We see in the top left image the Wellington Street right-of-way, which has been effectively closed as a thoroughfare or for vehicular traffic. On the top right image, we can also see Somerset Square, which abuts the site between the Wellington Street right-of-way. The property also comprises of some underutilized spaces being surface parking lots. Next slide, please. In the official plan, the subject property abuts traditional Main Street designation. As well, we see the property is bisected by 2 secondary plan districts, and one of the fundamentals of this application is to unify the policy regime for the site and the zoning. To the north is the Scott Street secondary plan, which encompasses the homes on Armstrong Street, and to the south is the Wellington Street West secondary plan, which encompasses those properties fronting on Wellington. Next slide, please. Here we see just a greater breakdown of the Scott Street secondary plan, where the homes in that area are designated as low-rise residential. Thank you. And likewise, on the Wellington Street West secondary plan, we are in the traditional Main Street designation in the Somerset Square policy district for those homes fronting on to Wellington Street. And it is worth noting that one specific property in this consolidation of lands was subject to a previous application where a similar process was undertaken. The lands were removed from the Scott Street secondary plan and consolidated into the Wellington Street West secondary plan to create a uniform policy regime. Next slide, please. Here we see the zoning currently. Again, the parcel I just mentioned and spoke to on the left, that 979, is consolidated into a TM zone. The intent here is to create a new TM zone for this parcel with a site-specific zoning schedule and performance standards. We note that the subject lands are within 600 meters of the Bayview transit station, which is the intersection of the Trillium and Confederation lines, as well as the subject properties in the design priority area, and has been reviewed by the Urban Design Review Panel. Thank you. Just some history on the evolution of the file. The original application came in as a 23-story tower with a 6-story podium. It had a off-centered pedestrian passageway, and the podium was starting to form this U-shaped form. This is not the application that's been considered and has been subsequently revised based on staff and public feedback. Next slide, please. Current application is for a 12-story mixed-use building. It includes a series of step backs and setbacks along the various frontages. It contains approximately 248 units, 148 below-grade parking stalls and 2 levels of parking, and 268 bike parking stalls. We see on the Armstrong Street elevation that the facade is effectively severed with the pedestrian passageway. Next slide, please. This slide just shows quickly the transition of the building, starting from Armstrong, where it's increasing from 4 to 12 stories respectively, and on Wellington Street West, where we transition back down from 12 to 9 to 2 stories respectively. And again, this would be captured in the implementing zoning bylaw. Next slide, please. Again, just a quick look at the proposed elevations showing the materiality, the articulation, and the intent to break up the massing of the building and show a clear datum line along the Wellington Street frontage, which is required for that pedestrian and human scale. Thank you. And showing here the intent of the high-rise guidelines for implementing transition to the low-rise areas to the north that are within the Scott Street secondary plan. With respect to the policy regime that staff looked at, the application is consistent with the official plan, section 222, that speaks about managing intensification. These policies set target areas for intensification in forms, including high-rise buildings, that can occur if compatibility objectives are met. Specifically at 22210, talks about intensification in building heights, and it talks and outlines where intensification may occur in a variety of built forms and developments, such as taller buildings. Again, providing that compatibility is met. These sites for intensification should be located in areas supported by transit networks and within a mix of uses. Policy 22217 outlines that secondary plans may specify greater heights, and that when an OP amendment is proposed to increase such heights, applicants must demonstrate that impacts have been addressed. Further policies in the OP, such as 22210 and 256, must also be addressed, and that a community amenity has been identified and provided. And in this case, the community amenity will be improvements to the Wellington Street right-of-way that would be implemented through the site plan control process. With respect to policy 25613, these are the specific provisions for high-rise buildings, which is worth noting that were not in place at the time that the Wellington Street West secondary plan was created. These came into the OP through official plan amendment 150. But these provide specific direction to help support this type of application, where it speaks to the OP intends that the highest density development should be located where rapid transit is provided. It also specifically notes that secondary plans and community design plans should locate high-rise buildings close to rapid transit stations to support this objective. Policy 25613 outlines further criteria such as being in a prominent location, assessing sun, shadow, and microclimate impacts, providing a mix of uses and minimizing impacts on the established low-rise neighborhoods. And staff are proposing or suggesting to you that through the transition proposed in the building, this is addressed. The project is also consistent with the policies of traditional main streets that allow for secondary or for taller buildings to be considered, and is consistent with the design objectives and urban design and compatibility policies that speak to both the functional operations and characteristics of the building, such as parking and loading, and these will be further assessed through the site plan control application. The application is also consistent with the OP, where it speaks to a situation where there's no criteria to assess a high-rise building. Currently, a high-rise form is not permitted in this area, but to assess that application and that request, we look at massing and scale, the planned function and patterns and transition techniques, which I've taken you through. The application also responds to design guidelines for high-rise housing. The proposal has evolved through time to respond to comments on the urban design review panel, which did not support the tower concept, has realigned the mid-block connection, and reduced the impact of the mechanical penthouse. Lastly, just to wrap up, the project is consistent with some of the design criteria specifically outlined in the Wellington Street West secondary plan that speaks to a human scale podium along Wellington Street West. And as well, the proposal includes a Section 37 agreement that has both monetary and non-monetary contributions. Next slide, please. This is simply showing the proposed zoning schedule for the project, which would capture the building form as we see. Thank you. Our next steps, as part of the approval, as I noted, these are a breakdown of the Section 37 details, which include cash contributions and non-cash contribution. Next slide. Procedurally, the applicant will be required to enter into a Section 37 agreement should Planning Committee approve the application. Implementing bylaws would be advanced through a council agenda. We'd move through our statutory timelines, and then a site plan submission would be initiated by the applicant. Thank you. That's my presentation.
Okay, thank you, Simon. We will come back to you and staff for questions after delegations. We have 3 representatives from the applicant. I'm not sure if it'll be, well, we have Rod Leahy, Miguel Tremblay, and Maureen Flanagan. Not sure if it's Rod or Miguel who's going to be giving us a presentation before we go to our delegations.
Good morning, it's Miguel Tremblay from FOTEN. Just given that Simon has covered all of the policies in very comprehensive manner, I'm just gonna yield my time to Rod, and Rod's gonna speak a little bit more detail to the building transition and form.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, Rod.
Good morning. Thank you, Chair. I have to note that's the first time in history that Miguel has yielded time to me, so I'd like it on the record. So if I can, we prepared a quick presentation. Melanie, if you could go to the next slide. I'll speak just quickly to location. Simon's done a great presentation to describe the project location. I just want to highlight the uniqueness of this site when we look at it and its relationship to the community. The adjacency to the park obviously is front and center with the closing of the street on Wellington Street. As mentioned, the Armstrong House immediately to the north, the existing 10-story building across Hilda Street, and what I believe the LCBO, what used to be the Salvation Army, across Garland Street. So it's a fairly unique site in terms of the sort of larger land assemblies in the area. So go to the next slide. Just also a little bit of brief history. This project has been in the office quite some time. Every time I sort of finish design, my client would inform me that they've just purchased property adjacent. So we started off originally just with the 9-story portion, which Simon mentioned on Garland Street. And then they acquired the next property, the garage, and what was the Susie Q site. Sort of got us 3/4 of the site. We then met with the ward councillor. We had a very good meeting about where we were going. And at his suggestion, he looked at what are the opportunities of possibly purchasing those 2 properties on Hilda Street. Like everything else, you know, the last 2 properties are the most expensive, but it was really interesting the impact that it had. So it allowed us to change. By purchasing these, it allowed us to do a number of things. One, to close off Wellington Street completely. So we then have an opportunity for the city to expand that park area and do something quite unique, because you can see it adds a significant amount of area to that in terms of what the city could do with the park. From a functional point of view, it allowed us to move our access to the underground parking garage that was on Armstrong Street to Hilda Street. And that worked very well in controlling traffic. When we began looking at this as the second option with the U-shaped building you see in front of us, we were still fixated on the idea of this mid-block connection. And it really was a more romantic idea because you may or may not be aware, but Armstrong's House, the frontage of Armstrong House actually used to be Wellington Street. And then over time, the land was severed, developed. Armstrong Street was actually put in place and severed the house from Wellington Street. So opening this sort of reconnects Armstrong House to Wellington Street with that direct through block connection, and allows us actually to really develop the site into unique ways. I think Simon went through the stepping that we did, that sort of 4-story to 9 to 12, and again on the front streets from Wellington Street with the 2-story. So if we go to the next slide, it's important to look at the functionality of the ground floor. You can see on Wellington Street, we've got some nice retail street that's retail areas that front on Wellington Street. The idea is to have really good neighborhood type retail spaces in here. As we move down Garland and around Armstrong Street, you'll see the introduction of, these are all 2-story, 3-bedroom townhouses that we thought would be a really unique approach to developing our frontage along Armstrong Street. they have front yards. The one on Armstrong Street have front yards with direct access off the street, and provide an opportunity for family units, which is with all the projects we're doing, I'd have to say it's quite lacking in most of our projects. So, sorry, if we go to the next slide. Next slide shows the architecture that we've come through working with the planning department. And you can see the major focus was to have that two-story reference line, which is part of the traditional Main Street approach, the mass of the 9-story building, which picks up the building immediately to the west of us, and then the upper 3 floors, more of a lighter material. Go to the next slide. You can see here, we've actually connected Armstrong House with that in that 4-story portion. You can see we've taken the sandstone material off of the Armstrong House and replicated it on the side, and ours sort of tying the 2 streets together. You can see in here the access to the underground parking garage, all parking below grade. And of course, that's significantly stepping to really reinforce the residential aspect. You go on the next slide. Just some views of that active, go to the next slide, active sort of street frontage along Wellington Street.
Thank you, Rod.
Okay.
Thank you, Rod. So we will come back to the applicant after our delegations for questions from the committee. We have a number of delegations registered. The Hintonburg Community Association has 4 speakers registered who each have 5 minutes: Cheryl Parrott, Linda Hode, Larry Hudon, and Christy Ross. We'll just bring you into the meeting or into the panel.
I'm the first presenter, so I'm ready to start if we're ready to go.
Yes, we are. Good morning, Cheryl.
Okay, thank you. So my name is Cheryl Parrott, and the Hintonburg Community Association is now celebrating its 30th anniversary. We have 240 paid member households, and the boundaries of the association are the O Train to Holland and Scott Street to the Queensway. Next slide, please. The HCA opposes this application for a 12-story high-rise building where the Wellington Street secondary plan limits the height to 6 stories, mid-rise buildings on traditional main streets. It was adopted with full knowledge of the coming LRT Line 1 and with 10 years of experience with LRT Line 2. It meets the planning objectives of the OP for intensification and compatibility. Over the last 10 years, developments have been able to meet this plan, as you can see. A 2-meter step back is required on buildings over 4 stories to form a 2 to 3-story base to ensure the existing low-rise human scale, which you can see on these 6-story buildings. The proposal has a very small 0.8 meter setback at the 2nd story, and then it rises to 9 and then 12 stories. So really it's going to appear as 12 stories on Wellington Street, not that short podium. It does not comply with the purpose and intent of the policy vision to ensure compatibility with human scale buildings. It's the position of the HCA that the requirement for a step back at 2 meters above the 3rd story in the current zoning bylaw and the building height must be maintained. Next slide. On the left, you'll see a high-rise building that was accommodated in the secondary plan. And this was due to a density transfer, which incorporated the historic Bethany House at front and is well set back from the street, reducing the impact. On the right is a new 9-story building, and this is at an identified gateway intersection of Parkdale. So these buildings comply with the secondary plan. Next slide. This is Armstrong and the low-rise residential area. It's being redeveloped at appropriate heights. This is the type of intensification that should be found within the neighborhood line. The new R4U zoning allows 8 units on small 10 by 30 meter lots, and that's equivalent to a density of 266 units per hectare. So this is far greater density than the 80 units per hectare that the new OP is looking to attain in the interurban transect over the next 25 years. We didn't oppose this, and so we are more than playing our part in intensification. Next slide. Ottawa Community Immigrant Services Organization is just to the left of the site. And it is a mid-rise building of 9 stories built 30 years ago. And you can actually count the stories, it's 9 stories. The small footprint does not impact Armstrong Street. It predates the secondary plan, but still meets all aspects and provided a huge community benefit. This nonprofit affordable housing provider houses new Canadians, especially those with large families. And please note, there's 28 solar panels on the roof that will be completely shaded in the afternoons in the winter months, according to the submitted shadow study. So there will be some revenue impact to this nonprofit housing provider. Next slide.
1 minute.
The proposed site is at the very bottom of this map. It's not located at the end of the Wellington traditional Main Street as it transitions into Bayview Station Transit Node. It's a distance away, and yes, it's within 600 meters, but so is our entire community. And you can see the large buildings there with, there's 18 of them that go from 12 to 65 stories. And the transition in height is supposed to happen within the mixed use center, not in the traditional Main Street area. Next slide, please. This site is not a gateway. The gateway sites are identified in the secondary plan at the corners of Bayswater and Wellington and Bayswater Somerset. And it stipulates that these be a maximum of 9 stories. We ask you to please reject this plan and make them to conform to our secondary plans. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cheryl. There's a couple of questions from councillors. I can take the questions now, or Cheryl, would you prefer to wait till we're finished all of the Hintonburg Community Association presentations?
It doesn't really matter. We could do them now if that's more appropriate, so they may not get lost in some of the other presentations. All right, well, we'll start with Councillor Leeper.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you very much, Cheryl. It's the 2-story step back on the Wellington front. It goes from the front of the building, and then it goes back 0.8 meters after the second floor before going up to 9 stories and then to 12. Does that represent the expression of a 2 or 3 story podium in your view, where the secondary plan is seeking that?
I don't believe it does. I don't think you'll even see it, that 0.8 meters. It's really just a little over 2 feet. So that's not going to be perceivable from someone walking down Wellington. You're going to see a 9-story wall. The 12-story, up to the 12 may be set back a bit, but it really will be a 9-story wall on Wellington Street and on the 2 side streets of Hilda and Garland, which are very narrow streets. There isn't even a setback. So it just goes up completely to 9 stories.
On Garland, exactly. There is no step back on the Garland side. It goes up straight 9 stories. And then there's a relatively, there's a bit of a step back before it goes to 12. I think it's important because we want to talk about how this building is proposed to fit within the larger CDP area. The building next to it, the Sakeleys have the LCBO building. And what is the concern if we start going up to 12 stories at this location with respect to what happens as you continue west on Wellington Street?
So the real concern is that this sets a precedent. I know that we always hear it doesn't set a precedent from city staff, but we know it does because this developer has used other buildings as precedents. So there is an application coming forward, probably within a few months' time, that will be for 18 stories at an intersection. We know that the development, that those properties next door on the other side of Garland, where the LCBO is, will want at least the same. And nobody is going to accept less. So this means that traditional main streets no longer have a 9-story maximum as the new OP is suggesting. This breaks the barrier, and I believe it breaks the barrier for all main streets. So even though the new OP says Main Street should be 9 stories, if this goes up to 12 and then the next one goes to 18 because this one got 12, then anything goes.
Yeah, and there is that application for an 18-story tower at Parkdale and Wellington that is obviously going to be a significant discussion in the community. The 9-story that is at the corner of Parkdale and Wellington, the I guess it's 18-story that's in behind Rosemount. I think you said the Hintonburg Community Association did not oppose those.
Yeah, we did not oppose it. And the one that's that we showed in the picture that is a high rise, I believe is 13 stories, and it was a density transfer to keep that historic building. And it has a very large lawn in front. And that was part of the secondary plan as well, that large lawn had to be kept as green space. And they've made it so it's a public, private owned public green space.
Yeah, it's a nice little park, and if you're there on a Saturday afternoon in the summer visiting Stella Luna, it's quite jumping around there. It's a very pleasant spot. It's interesting to note that building that is out of the photo at the corner of Rosemount and Wellington. It goes up a story, and then there is a fairly significant step back before it continues to the 6th story, which feels very different. I'm assuming that the Hintonburg Community Association, if this is going to be a taller building here, would prefer that expression of a step back to maintain sort of some of the feeling of the human scale of the main street would be preferable to the 0.8 meters that we have in this building proposed.
Absolutely. And those other buildings have used it as patio space. And so that also brings eyes onto the street and animates the street and livens it up, because you actually have the eyes on the street. And that's really important. So this needs to be stepped back at the 2nd or 3rd story, a balcony width at least, and it should be no higher than the 6 stories.
Excellent. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you.
Hey, Councillor Dudas.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Cheryl, I just had a quick question. 3 years ago, I understand the Community Association worked with and was in favor of a change to one of the lots that would allow from the 6-story designation to the 9. And I wanted to understand a little bit as to why you approved this, like how that kind of came to be that the Community Association was willing to accept the 9.
And I'll let one of the other presenters, she will be presenting on that and can explain it, but I will just add my own 2 cents. We struggled with that, and we agreed to it in exchange for 2 deeply affordable units. Wasn't a lot. I wanted a whole floor or more, but in the end, we felt that we could go to 9 stories just at the front of the building for those affordable units, as we were losing affordable units every day, and we still are losing affordable units every day. And so that was a compromised position, and some of the units in that entire block have been vacant and boarded and broken into and boarded for at least 5 years.
And that's what I wanted to understand, because I mean, that was only 3 years ago. Council approved that application. And as you said, the Community Association was willing to compromise. Like, that was a jump. That was a jump. So
yeah, it's quite a different building form, and we do have that as part of our other the presentation, the next presentation actually.
Okay, and so then this just leads to my final quick question. So the 9 stories, you've already been asked to compromise. You were willing to go to that. How different is it for the community for the consideration of the 12?
The 12 is just, it's a massive face right on Wellington. It doesn't, it just is not human scale, really. That one was a very small building. This is the entire block that will be 12 stories. That was a very small part of it, just at a corner. So it does have a different impact. It's not human scale.
Okay, thank you, Chef.
Councillor Hubley.
Thank you, Chair. I'm looking for some clarification here as to something that was just said in the presentation. So what I'm trying to find out here, I will say up front, I had a meeting with Councillor Leeper and received emails from residents on this application. So I've got a few areas I need to get clarity here on. It was mentioned in there that under the new OP, the main streets will be limited to 9 stories. But my understanding with the OP, and so this is where I'd like to get some clarification, is that there will be a clause in there to talk about when you are in transit-oriented development within range of any of the LRT stations, for example, that there will be exceptions to that 9 stories. Is that correct?
Councillor, is that a question for the applicant or a question for, sorry?
Well, I'd like to try with the applicant first if I could to see, but I think before we go any further into presentations, I think that's a key point we need to clarify. And because my understanding with Councillor Leeper was that it's a hard 9 stories at with the main streets, which is what he wants to protect. And I would share that concern with them. If there's not a requirement here for more height or a possibility of more height when you come into nearby transit stations. And in this case, I believe they're within 600 meters of 2 stations.
So, okay, so you're asking a point of clarification of the presentation that was already made around what the new OP may say around main streets. Can staff give us a quick answer to that?
And I'd like to chirp in as well, if possible.
Let's see if we can get an answer from staff on this.
Through the chairs, I've yet to see the final version of the policies related to traditional Métis, but I don't fundamentally disagree that 9 stories is the general direction that it's going to be posed to. We just saw an email go out for our next open house on the new OP, but I'd have to defer to policy staff to give you specifics on that wording or what the intent is to reconcile traditional main streets sites within transit. Thank you.
And if I may, Mr. Chair as well, or Chair as well, whatever the new OP, council will have to decide that, I guess, later this fall. But just want to mention that we're dealing with the current policy regime, and the current policy regime is, with respect to this application, says that you should have our taller buildings are supported near transit infrastructure, such as the Bayview Station, for example, which is less than 600 meters away, if it meets compatibility criteria. And as presented in the staff report, it does meet those criteria. And in a nutshell, that's basically why we're recommending approval of this application. So we have to deal with the current policy regime that we have today.
Could I just say something as well?
Cheryl, I'm gonna pause you because we just allowed Councillor Hubley for just a clarification to staff. But Councillor Hubley, do you have any questions for?
No, that gives us good clarity that we're looking at this under the current policy. I'll wait to hear Councillor Leeper's comments after and may have further questions after that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Hubley. Thank you, Cheryl. We'll move on to our next public delegation, Linda Hode with Hintonburg Community Association.
Can we go back to the slide, please? And it will be the next slide following this slide. Thank you. Good morning. I'm Linda Hode. I'm the co-chair of the Hintonburg Community Association Zoning Committee. I will address an important aspect of the planned context of this site. which is transition from Main Street to low-rise residential. Both the Wellington Street West Secondary Plan and the Scott Street Secondary Plan contain policies to ensure appropriate transition between areas where higher heights are permitted and the established low-rise residential areas. The current proposal for a 12-story high-rise building does not conform to the planned transition policies for the protection of the low-rise neighborhood in these two secondary plans. The Wellington Street Main Street, which is shown in this illustration to the right of the dark line, and the site, of course, is shown by a star. Wellington Street Main Street is governed by the TM traditional Main Street zone policies: 6-story maximum height, rear yard setback abutting a residential zone of 7.5 meters, and the use of a 45-degree angular plane abutting residential zones. The Scott Street Secondary Plan directs intensification to certain areas while protecting the low-rise character in other areas. The plan introduced an important element, the neighborhood line, which protects the low-rise areas. The neighborhood line is that dark line I referred to. It's our position that the neighborhood line should not be removed and the Scott Street Secondary Plan should not be amended. Can we have the next slide, please? This is just another illustration of the neighborhood line and its impact on the lot fabric. Next slide, please. The following slides illustrate the result of removing the neighborhood line. This slide shows you the traditional Main Street building envelope. The Main Street is to the left on this particular slide, and the center property line is the neighborhood line. The TM zoning creates a sensitive transition from the Main Street height to the R4 zoned neighborhood. Next slide, please. This is the 2018 application building envelope, and I will refer in more detail to this later. This is a 9-story mid-rise building with a step back after the 4th story on the Wellington Street facade, which is on the right in this image, and 4 stories facing Armstrong, increasing to 5, then 9 stories, respecting an angular plane. Next slide, please. This is the current proposal, and I'll ask you to ignore the green lines. We couldn't take them out after we had put them in for our submission to the planning department. This is a 12-story high-rise with minimal step backs on the Wellington Main Street facade. There is a minimal 4-story volume facing Armstrong, rising immediately to a 9-story, then 12-story volume in the area which should be protected by the neighborhood line. The staff report concedes that a 45-degree angular plane transition is not achieved with the proposed built form between the adjacent low-rise neighborhood and the proposal, noting that elements of the proposed building do pierce the plane. Therefore, it's the position of the Hintonburg Community Association that the proposal does not comply with the 45-degree angular plane required for transition in the urban design guidelines for high-rise buildings, and thus does not provide an appropriate transition to the low-rise neighborhood as required by section 4.11 of the official plan. Next slide, please. This is the one we've been asked questions about. You'll have read in Mr. Diaco's report, and Councillor Hubley brought it up, the 2018 rezoning of part of this block, which he's used, of course, to justify the recommendation to approve the present proposal. It was not opposed by the Hintonburg Community Association for the following reasons: height and massing. As you've seen, the applicant reduced the height at the rear of the property from 6 stories to 4 stories to achieve a better transition. The built form conforms to the bylaw requirement for a 45-degree angular plane. Most importantly, this is a 9-story mid-rise building. Gateway. We were able to agree that this property could be considered a gateway. It's one building at the corner of Garland, similar to those other corner sites identified in the secondary plan, not an entire block. The location at the intersection of Wellington and Somerset Streets is unique, and the site has the potential to be reviewed for major entryways into the community from both east and west. Affordable housing, as Ms. Parrott mentioned, the applicant offered 2 units of 57 to be set aside as affordable rental units in perpetuity by a legally enforceable agreement with a non-profit housing provider. No, this offer was important, an important precedent for the provision of affordable housing in Ottawa, which we would like to see repeated. No commitment to affordable housing has been made by the current applicant in spite of frequent requests. In conclusion, we urge you to refuse this proposal to amend 2 secondary plans that establish the built form and performance standards for this site. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. Are there any questions for Linda from the committee? Councillor Leeper, go ahead.
Thanks. And I just want to, for it's a complicated topic, but for the benefit of the committee, Linda, the neighborhood line, am I correct in thinking that this block has properties that face north on Armstrong and it has properties that face south onto Wellington? The neighborhood line roughly bisects it going east-west, so that the rear properties facing onto Armstrong in the community design plan were intended to remain low-rise, and that the buildings facing onto Wellington were intended to transition to the mid-rise. Is that accurate?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so the on the properties that are facing Armstrong, the neighborhood line would have maintained those buildings at something like 4 stories at most.
Yes.
Okay. And in the case of this proposal, there's a 4-story expression facing onto Armstrong, but that 4 stories only goes back, I want to say 1/3 of the depth of the Armstrong properties. Is that roughly accurate?
Yes, that may be a bit of an exaggeration. It's not a great extent, but it is, it is there.
So there is some it might not even be 1/3 of the lot. The 4 stories only goes back for a certain amount before it goes up into those 9 stories. Yeah. And the 9 stories starts within that area that would have been designated as on the low-rise side of the line, were it not for moving the neighborhood line as proposed by the developer here.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. It can be difficult to visualize why the neighborhood line is important, and I just wanted to run through that for clarity. I appreciate it. Thank you, Linda.
Thank you.
Not seeing any other questions, so thank you very much, Linda.
Okay.
Larry Hudon from the HCA is next.
Okay. Oops, thank you, Melody. Just need to adjust my screen here. I seem to have lost my speaking notes. Good morning, Mr. Chair, councillors. I'm Larry Hudon. I live on Rosemount Avenue in Hintonburg. Thank you for your time this morning. Thank you, Melody. You just heard from our very knowledgeable Hintonburg Community Association Planning and Development Committee on exactly why this submission should be rejected. I would like now to speak briefly to councillors about the importance of trust in the planning documents that we residents negotiated together with city officials and developers. Secondary plans and the CDPs done as part of the secondary plans are very, very important. These are negotiated plans where the community buys into and agrees to support intensification within the parameters of the plan. The city and development industry are at the table along with the community. All stakeholders engage in a process of compromise that constitutes good planning and meets the city's intensification goals. The community and other stakeholders put considerable effort into plans that make sense to the city as a whole, but also make sense in the context of our specific community. The investment of time and effort by all parties is significant. Community members seek to protect what they love about where they live, protect the attributes of their community while helping to define how we progress as a city. Once a secondary plan is approved, it becomes part of the city's official plan. Therefore, the city should require conformity to the secondary plans and follow their direction. Yet, planning staff report is justifying amendments, citing alignment with the intent of, rather than adherence to, the details of the policy directives held within the 2 secondary plans governing this site. The role of the secondary plan is a key element in the discussion of the draft official plan. Mr. Migueles has assured us that existing secondary plans will continue to be enforced in the new official plan and will trump the emerging policy that will establish 9 stories as a norm on traditional main streets. Thus, citizens are watching the city's decision on this closely. If the City Planning Committee chooses to set aside and ignore the clear planning directions in not only 1, but 2 secondary plans to approve this proposal, there would be little confidence in the city's assurances that secondary plans will be respected under the draft official plan, possibly undermining literally years of work. And such exceptions can be and sometimes are cited by developers as precedents to allow for similar development proposals that potentially further erode the integrity of the official plan and its component secondary plans. As well, expectations of zoning requirements may be exceeded could result in developers overpaying for properties. Councillors on planning committee and city council must ensure citizens' confidence and trust in our planning process by making the right decisions and adhering to agreed upon planning frameworks. Intensification targets are easily attainable within the existing limits of existing secondary plans and other planning documents. Planning committee members and city council must trust that the official plan, secondary plans, community development plans, and traditional Main Street directives are indeed the result of meaningful stakeholder engagement, ensuring contextual appropriateness. Adherence to these important documents is paramount. If secondary plans are not respected, confidence and trust may lessen and engagement decline. Skepticism will likely increase and outcomes sought in secondary plans will become less assured, with fears rising that spot zoning will become normalized. In an ideal world, community associations and other stakeholders would be content working on recreational infrastructure, community programs, sports, artistic activities, and other core objectives. Instead, we fear that we could end up spending precious financial and human resources protecting our communities from the development proposals that are out of step with our secondary and community design plans. Please, this morning, make the right decision and send this proposal back for retooling into a plan that we can all buy into, a development that conforms to our secondary plans and is appropriate for our community. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry. Councillor Leeper has a question.
Thanks, and Larry, good presentation. I just want to make sure I understand what you're asserting. The official plan, as it's being drafted, has some fairly wide open language in it. So, for example, in neighborhoods within, say, the inner urban transect, buildings can go to 4 stories. And on traditional main streets, buildings can go to 9 stories. And at gateway or at in areas that are close to transit, within a few hundred meters, even greater density can be anticipated. I think I think that is your impression of the official plan as well.
I would say that traditional main streets are limited to 6 and only 9 may be requested at gateway sites.
Sure, I'm just looking at the new direction of the official plan, which has some wide open language. Mm-hmm. The intent, though, on the part of planning staff is to lend some geographic precision to the language of the official plan. To say, you know what, there's wide open language, 4 stories in low-rise neighborhoods, generally speaking, 9 stories on traditional main streets, generally speaking, and we're going to limit the height around transit according to secondary plans. Is that, the Hintonburg Community Association has been coming along with the official plan to this date, understanding the thrust of it. If we approve this, what is your belief about what the planning department is telling you on geographic specificity that puts some limits around the wide open language of the new official plan?
Well, if you approve it, it means that the wide open language of the draft of, official plan will be exploited, and it will set precedents, and it will be really difficult to midterm and long term actually predict outcomes in these geographically specific areas. We understand that we are currently under the existing policy, and we have secondary plans that exist and have been approved, and we're trying to limit development to what is appropriate to our neighborhood in terms of height and density, while recognizing that we are fully behind higher density and intensification. We have never fought that, and we have contributed greatly to the new official plan, and we would like to bring more precision to that language. In the meantime, city planners are telling us that the existing secondary plans will be respected and protected by the new draft official plan, and we're hoping that is so. If not, then there is an amount of sweat equity by community members and other stakeholders that seems to dissipate at some point, because that's not what we agreed to. And it's very frustrating for community associations and individual residents and citizens.
Fantastic. Thank you, Larry. Thanks, Chair.
Councillor Menard.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Chair. Larry, thanks for your presentation. I just wanted to keep on that point because I think secondary plans are going to become more and more important in our city. And I just wanted to know, have you participated in a secondary planning process before?
My colleagues, Linda, who preceded me, Cheryl Parrott, and Jay Baltz, who is unfortunately out of town for this meeting, have contributed significantly to those discussions. I'm speaking today mostly as a resident concerned that hard work by our association is respected. But if you have a technical question, Linda or Cheryl could respond to it.
No, I was just asking because, you know, I've sat through them and they are very comprehensive. They involve developers, community, other business stakeholders, city staff, and other planners that you know, contribute heavily to them. And normally the secondary plan process actually extends beyond the zoning that currently exists in those areas. It actually, you know, uplifts the zoning, uplifts the height, it increases the density in those areas. And so that the secondary plans as they are normally, as far as my experience goes, and maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but increases in density compared to what is allowed under the existing zoning. Mm-hmm. And I guess for me, this is an essential point: is how can we get to a point where there is trust established in the city, where we're not having these constant battles, and for the 1% or 0.5% of applications that are very controversial, how do we get to a point where we're respecting what was put in place previously by staff, by community members, by developers, by business advocates? How do we do that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I wish I could answer accurately. I think by planning and council making appropriate decisions around these applications that respect hard work, and when there are contentious, larger site outside of the box proposals, that there is a more robust consultation process with the community and other stakeholders to come to some agreement about these sites. And so now, here we are possibly approving or rejecting this proposal, and we haven't had a lot of consultation on this. It's a huge game changer. If you're familiar with this neighborhood, I mean, that's a very important park and green space, and it's also it's one of the hearts of Hintonburg. It's very animated there, and we have to get this right. We have to get it right for that part of the neighborhood at the eastern end of Hintonburg. We also have to get it right for the rest of Welly West. Cheryl had pictures up of recent developments that were built under the existing regime that seemed to be profitable for the developers, that respected all of the rules and limitations. And they're beautiful buildings. My wife and I own a unit in one of them. It's, this is a great addition to the neighborhood. We just don't think this one's quite right. And so let's get this one right, and let's not set precedents. In terms of your overarching question, it's a good question that council and the planning department need to think hard about as well, in terms of regaining trust, making right decisions, and making decisions that respect long-standing negotiations. That earns trust. Bad decisions, trust is tough to earn and it's easy to lose. So, a series of bad decisions would lose trust.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you, Councillor. Seeing no more questions, thank you, Larry. Let's hope we can rein it back in. We're straying into a broader discussion on secondary plans and official plans and their roles. I understand there's some relevance to the conversation in front of us, but hope for future questions and delegations we can keep focused on what's in front of us. We have Christy Ross presenting on behalf of the Hintonburg Community Association. Good morning, Christy.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, co-chairs, and members of the Planning Committee. My name is Christy Ross, and I'm a land use planner And today I'll be presenting on behalf of the Community Association. As you have heard, the application does not conform to the policy vision or the purpose and intent of 2 approved secondary plans. Both plans contain interpretation clauses, and you can, sorry, Melody, you can move to the next slide for my discussion of this point, that direct that plans are to be read and interpreted as City Council's policy direction for municipal actions, particularly in the review of development proposals, and that all sections should be reviewed. Next slide. So with respect to the Wellington Street secondary plan, the main change, and I'll put it to committee, that is the significant change, is the replacement of the direction in this plan with respect to TM policies, moving them from a mid-rise characterization to a high-rise characterization. And in the introductory comments that the city made with respect to the proposal, they were focusing on the city's ability within their official plan to seek taller buildings near transit. Certainly, transit is applicable here. The traditional Main Street sort of policy in the Wellington West secondary plan is for a maximum of 6 stories. But built within that, as you can see on the screen, is this exception clause that allows up to 9 stories. So I would put it to committee that already in the approved secondary plan, there is a mechanism to achieve higher heights in the site context fashion, and that it's really that should be utilized here, not a shift, a fundamental shift from mid-rise to high-rise through a 12-story proposal. Next slide. We've spoken extensively about the neighborhood line. I just want to draw you to sort of its very innovative and unique planning purpose. It's the only concept of this in secondary plans in Ottawa. And it basically allows the community and all stakeholders to prioritize where intensification should go and where low-rise character should remain. Both are important from a planning context. It also provides that any future lot consolidation will not change the location of the neighborhood line. However, that's what this proposal is seeking to do. Next slide. Numerous policies in the parent official plan make it clear that the direction in secondary plans should take precedence over official plan policies. For instance, there's the direction that secondary plans can be more restrictive. There's also the other direction that greater heights can be approved through them. Next slide, please. The clearest articulation of this is in section 4.11 policy 10, which provides where a secondary plan process establishes criteria for compatibility of new development. The city will assess the appropriateness of the development using the criteria for massing and scale established in the plan. So the term will assess creates a positive obligation on the city to ensure development proposals conform to criteria in the plan related to height, setbacks, and position on the site. Next slide. So the Ottawa official plan provides clear direction that traditional main streets are to be mid-rise, and by mid-rise I mean in the 5 to 9 story range. The preamble to section 3.6.3 provides this plan supports mid-rise building heights on traditional main streets, but secondary plans may identify circumstances where different building heights may be permitted. So once again, as I stated earlier in my comments, that is already achieved in this plan. Greater building heights above 6 stories are permitted, up to 9 stories. And the submission that we're making today is that the city should stick to that planning direction. So you might be thinking that these applications will result in an additional 3 stories, and that could be permitted under this exception clause I've been speaking of. And also that only a portion of the building falls within the neighborhood line that is high rise or mid rise in nature rather than low rise. So how significant is this? I feel it's very significant because allowing high rise uses on traditional main streets and sort of within this sort of unique neighborhood line is a fundamental shift in policy direction, and it will affect human scale of traditional main streets and also open up development into the high rise 10 to 30 stories. So it's submitted that such a significant change should not be approved through a site-specific application with limited consultation, but rather that comprehensive secondary planning process, such as that found in 2.5 sub 3, which is, for, secondary plans and community plans, ought to be done, particularly when you're proposing higher heights and high-rise buildings in this case. And I'm relying on policy 2.2.2, which the city spoke of at the beginning. So in closing, it's our submission that the city must follow their approved official plan and secondary plans. And thank you very much. And I'll open the floor up to questions.
Thank you, Christy. Councillor Leeper.
Thanks. Christy, I do want to give you the opportunity to speak to the last bullets that I saw on your slide there with respect to 2.2.10 and the consultation process that should be followed for a fairly major change. I also noted in the staff presentation at the beginning, something that's not in the report, which is that they are suggesting that this is adherent to 2.2.17, which also speaks to the secondary planning consultation mechanisms and what kind of criteria need to be met in order to achieve adherence with the official plan. Can you speak to 2.2.10 and 2.2.17 and whether or not it's meeting those criteria?
Certainly. So I think it probably makes sense to start with 2.2.2 policy 17, which really provides the test for increases, if we can say that. So I'll just read a little bit for you because I don't believe it was up on my slides or the city slides. So for official plan amendments to increase building heights that are established in a secondary plan, so that would be our situation, the proponent must demonstrate that the following criteria are met. So first criteria is impacts on the surrounding area have been assessed comprehensively. So I think if I can sort of allude you back and point you to the presentations we heard from Linda and Cheryl, I mean, they rose some concerns on that criteria with respect to shadowing, overlook, lack of transition, things of that nature, lack of not following of the 45-degree angular plane. The next test is that the direction in policy 2.2.210 is met. So 2.2.2 sub 10 it basically is talking about how intensification can occur. It mentions that taller buildings can be located in areas that support rapid transit and transit priority networks. And that different buildings can be established through a secondary planning process. So with respect to that, I mean, I have like 2 points. The point I made earlier, which was that within the Wellington West secondary plan, there already is a mechanism for considering taller buildings. The floor is 6 stories, 6-story maximum, except if it's in a special policy area. So this site is in a special policy area. It's in the Somerset Square policies. If there's a section 37 benefit, there's a section 37 benefit here. But I mean, the key there is that you have a max up to 9 stories. And I mean, the secondary plan, the Scott Street secondary plan, explicitly states that these plans have sort of considered the intensification targets in the city. They've considered, the fact that there is rapid transit here. So that mechanism is built in, and I'm saying we don't have to move up to that high rise category, which brings me back to the next criteria in policy 17, which the requirements of section 2.5.6, so that's the section dealing with collaborative community building and secondary planning processes, must be met when a proposal involves a high rise use. So in that case, a proposal is involving a high rise use. The last criteria is a community amenity is provided, and we can all agree that section 37 agreement is being crafted in this case. So I'd like to just focus on that last relevant requirement. The requirements of section 2.5.6 are applied. So I'm not going to read you the very lengthy section that is, but that basically, just to paraphrase, it states that secondary planning doesn't need to be like a significant secondary plan, like for a whole area. It can guide development in a small planning area, such as a single site or a portion of the main street. So I would say that that's what we're talking about now. In these situations, the secondary planning process may lead to a plan prepared by the city or property owners in keeping with the terms of reference for the project. I don't believe there's been a terms of reference for this project. Further, the preamble goes on to say, in all situations, the project will include collaboration with the surrounding community in consultation with interested parties. Certainly through this, application through the Planning Act, there's been, a public open house. There's this opportunity to speak to you. The neighborhood has been invited to write letters, but I wouldn't say that there has been a process that sort of fits within this sort of community building secondary planning process. And in some instances, it might not be necessary. But I think in this instance, it is, because we're talking about a fundamental shift of mid-rise buildings has been the standard across Ottawa on traditional main streets. And now this is opening the door to a high-rise sort of articulation of building. And that's significant in that we're, looking at heights of 10 to, 30 stories. We're looking at whether or not these are human scale spaces that you'd want to walk down, shop, have mixed use uses, sit, relax, engage the city. I mean, if we have like high-rise buildings lining our traditional main streets, I'd say that makes them less user-friendly and usable. And I think the only other if we can just take you down into the policies, the one that I would sort of ask you to maybe review is policy 3, which says community secondary planning processes will be undertaken jointly by city departments, local residents, property owners, businesses, and other interested parties in a collaborative and public process. The city will work with property owners to resolve issues affecting the development of individual sites or larger parcels, and will provide opportunities for local community members and other interested parties to participate in the planning process. So I think because we're talking about a fundamental shift in not just one, but 2 official secondary plans, I think I've spoken at length about the traditional Main Street to high-rise, mid-rise to high-rise situation, but we're also dealing with this neighborhood line, which I think is a bit of a public contract between all stakeholders, city developers, the community, about where we should intensify and where we shouldn't. And this policy chips away at that. So I think from a precedent-setting basis, I think there's some significant cause for concern. And the choice of this committee and city council is to say, no, I'm sorry. This doesn't meet that test for higher heights and high-rise heights, but there is this mechanism within the current secondary plan that would allow greater heights and greater density, and that's in a 9-story sort of built envelope form. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. The one thing I just wanted to take a look at in the original staff presentation spoke to the urban high-rise guidelines, where when this secondary plan or these secondary plans were crafted, we didn't have the urban high-rise guidelines, but now we do. And I thought I heard in the staff presentation that now that we have these high-rise guidelines, high-rises are okay. Is that does having urban high-rise guidelines make it okay to start approving high-rises?
Well, I think in certain parts of the city, absolutely, and they'll inform that. But I think if I take you back to section 3.6.3 in the official plan, there's basically like a base statement of traditional main streets should have mid-rise built form. And I think the reason that that statement is there is a recognition that the way traditional main streets are constructed, very close, and in this case, adjacent to a low-rise community, a number of the things you see in the high-rise guidelines just aren't physically possible on the ground. And I think one of those key things is sort of like a big enough lot, like footprint, so to speak. You often are having a lot of trouble transitioning or having that 45-degree angular plane that provides the adequate transition in section 4.11 of the official plan. That is just, it's difficult to achieve. And I mean, the staff report in this instance says, certain elements of the building are popping out and exceeding that angular plane. So that, I think, is just one example of how you can't sort of interpret that as allowing, high-rise buildings, full stop throughout the site. And I guess maybe the other policy that springs to mind is there's specific policies for arterial main streets. And there's explicitly in the official plan, there's like a 9-story floor for those. And then, a list of criteria for having higher heights. And I think, once again, the reason that one can do that on an arterial main street is because those lots are larger. They are not necessarily located in the urban core of the old city, but here we're looking at one of the city's oldest traditional main streets, and there just isn't that sort of amount of land around. So that's why a lower height, a mid-rise height is more appropriate.
Thank you, Christy. I mean, I think the presentation that you've made today is very firmly grounded in official plan policies and well argued. I think you are well prepared and the Hindenburg Community Association residents are well prepared to take an approval by this committee and by council to the tribunal. And you've very clearly grounded your arguments in there. So thank you for that. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks, Councillor. Councillor Moffat.
Thank you. I have to say, I feel bad for anyone who doesn't do this for a living, that tries to watch this and tries to figure out what the hell 3.6.3 means or 2.2.2.17 and actually tries to follow along and think that we know what we're doing. So with that, Christy, would it be your contention that this, we all know this is going to go to the Ontario Land Tribunal. So when this gets there, regardless of who brings it there, is it your contention that it'll really hinge on the interpretation of 2.2.2.10 and subsequently 2.5.6?
So I think that is certainly an element of the case. And then I think, because that does provide a test for this, I think the other key sort of points or legal points that this will hinge on are sort of the proper interpretation of secondary plans and the sort of the level of deference that they should be given as well. So I think that would be another contention. And then also just how the City of Ottawa's official plan is structured around heights in traditional main streets and what the appropriate height is. So I think it would be sort of those three separate areas that would be sort of the key issues that would be decided upon by the OLT.
Because it is one of those constant challenges. I mean, not everywhere is subject to a secondary plan, but in this case, we have two secondary plans, but we have OPA 150, which came quite a bit after those two secondary plans. But we didn't amend the secondary plans in any way to reflect new policy. But we have this new policy that hangs out there, and we expect applications to adhere to the new policy, which actually contradicts some of our old policy. So I find this is the constant challenge that we have. It happens usually in zoning, OP to zoning policy. In this case, it's actually OP to secondary plan policy. So this is the kind of the tough thing that we have is I think you can fairly argue either way. And I think that's what we're seeing here today. But I'll be interested in asking staff later about the reverse side of that on those two policies and how they see it differently than clearly how yourself and Councillor Leeper and the community will see it. So I just wanted to ask about that because I think that's kind of an important piece of this.
Yeah, and Chair Moffat, if I may, and
Go ahead.
Let me know if I may not. So some of the policies that I did quote to you today are sort of part of that new, sort of the new official plan, like what was changed by OPA 150. Like for instance, I think the one that involved the language of the city will sort of apply the standards in secondary plans. I'm paraphrasing a little here. That was a change that came through that OPA amendment. So I wouldn't necessarily concur that there's been sort of a new change in direction that the secondary plans are no longer applicable with that. And then I also would just say that particularly the Wellington Street secondary plan is unique in that it does have that ability to allow taller buildings, which is, I think, the justification that was really prominent in the staff report of there's rapid transit, there can be taller buildings. Taller buildings are sort of already written into that plan, and it's really the question of how tall is appropriate.
All right, thank you.
Councillor Tierney.
Great, thank you. And thank you, Christy. You seem very well-versed in this, which is very helpful. Just real quickly, Councillor Hubley asked Doug James a question around, why would we approve this? And they said in relation to transit as being one of the main factors. Just briefly, can you comment on that and how you feel that would actually meet any kind of test?
Sure. So I think, this takes me back. I have a planning degree as well as a law degree. So this sort of takes me back to my planning days of, transit supported development and sort of that theory around building 15-minute communities and all of that. So what we have here throughout the official plan is this idea that one can have more height and density near transit. That's a given. Clearly that's applicable in this case. However, the official plan as worded speaks of having taller buildings. It also speaks of sort of the general floor for redevelopment within the general urban area, of which this site is part of the general urban area, as being low rise. So when we're talking about taller buildings, we're talking about taller than 4 stories. And in this case, we are also talking about taller than 6 stories. So there's a huge scope for intensification sort of within that envelope. And simply saying the official plan permits taller buildings near transit, true statement, absolutely a cornerstone of planning. That doesn't mean high-rise buildings are therefore permitted by transit. You can get intense intensification just through a mid-rise envelope. And I think you can see that on the ground in Hindenburg, in that the intensification targets, and I mean, Cheryl sort of alluded to this and mentioned this in her presentation, as did Linda. We're seeing intensification that blows, what we're talking about in the new official plan, which is 80 units per hectare, like out of the water. There is intense intensification happening here. My point is that it has to be compatible intensification. It needs to fit with the community. It needs to have a traditional main street that we want to walk down and shop at. It needs to be responsive, and that can be achieved within sort of the envelope that the Wellington Street secondary plan has created.
And just being cognizant of time here, because yes, I'm sure others want to get through some of this meeting. I appreciate that. So that's what I was looking for. I just want a little detail on that. Okay. And finally, since you're so well versed in this, and you've worn 2 hats, this is great. Have you seen anywhere through Ontario where there's been a tribunal hearing where they've struck down a staff recommendation or anything that would favor, just based on precedence, something like this? And obviously you'd have to look at the Mississaugas, the big regions. Have you seen anything? Do you have any research or knowledge on that?
So I can speak to sort of like 2 sort of instances and cases. So if you look at the city of Toronto, which I know in Ottawa we don't really like to do, but maybe go with me for a moment. They have sort of some neighborhood line policies within their official plan that sort of speak to where intensification should occur and where it should not occur. And as a sort of a generalization, they're pretty good at enforcing that, understanding that there's spots for intensification, but that intensification shouldn't happen everywhere. So that would be, I think, point number 1. And then with respect to sort of, there's a relatively recent Kingston case as well, with respect to where higher heights were involved. There was a bit of a heritage component there as well. But that sort of, there was a very successful case made on height at LPAT, as it then was. Now we're moving into the OLT. So there certainly is precedent for that. And there's old case law that maximums within sort of official plan policy should be respected. So there is some case law that would be pretty helpful for me to, and examples for me to draw.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much for your time today. It's really appreciated.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm seeing no more questions, so thank you, Christy. Our next speaker is Brian Innes. Brian, are you with us?
I am, Chair. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I'll be very brief. My name is Brian Innes. I am a resident of the community, and I would support the comments that have been made by the Community Association previously. And what was before you today as a committee is the approval of a high-rise building. It's the city's endorsement of a high-rise building on a main street. I believe we can support densification without putting high-rises on main streets and making a mockery of secondary plans by endorsing buildings twice as tall as what's outlined in the neighborhood secondary plan. This building is proposed to be built on a main street where I live with my family and our neighbors, a street like many Ottawa citizens live on, a street with secondary plan like many areas in the city with secondary plans. My comments today are about what this proposal means to me as a resident that lives here. I'm not a planner, I'm not a developer, I'm not a lawyer, but what I am is someone who lives in this vibrant Main Street neighborhood where I bike to work, meet our neighbors at Somerset Square Park, buy food and supplies, and stroll the streets when we need a breath of fresh air. The spirit of our neighborhood is shaped by its buildings, and these are predominantly low and mid-rise buildings, as you've heard. So as a resident, we chose to live in this area based on what exists and what's permitted to exist. And from my vantage point, I thought the secondary plan is a key piece of what shapes what's permitted in our area. But perhaps I was wrong. When I first read our secondary plan, I thought, wow, what a well thought out vision for the neighborhood. And thanks to those who contributed to it. A neighborhood where people want to live, work, play, and participate in. A secondary plan that people participated in and shaped. But perhaps I was wrong. When I saw the developer's initial proposal for 23 stories, I thought, wow, that's just ridiculous. They can't do that because the land use rules allow for 6 stories. And the land use rules don't allow for high rises at all. I was under the impression that when someone buys a property with certain zoning, whether it's developer or a resident, they can't go against people's comprehensive plan for the neighborhood and build a building that is 2 times or 4 times the height of what's allowed. But perhaps I was wrong. Perhaps the words in all these planning documents are just words and don't have meaning at all. Perhaps the time and effort spent by the community to develop secondary plans don't have meaning either, because maybe that's not who grants permissions to developers. Perhaps any Ottawa resident on a main street or who's remotely close to a transit station, whether it's the 300 meters proposed in the new official plan around special areas, or the 600 meters that's been referenced in this discussion, perhaps all of those people should expect high rises in their neighborhood next. I'm not an expert, but what I see is the city endorsing a high-rise building in an area with a secondary plan that limits height to 6 stories. That is a building that is half as tall as the one recommended to you today. The words from experts are in the report though. On page 4, it says, although the proposed building is 12 stories, the Wellington West secondary plan allows for the consideration of additional height up to maximum of 9 stories. So I'm confused. How can a 12-story building be consistent with a plan that allows for 9 stories? On page 39, it says the panel believes that this site belongs to the mid-rise character of Wellington Street. A mid-rise building is strongly recommended. So I'm confused. How does a high-rise fit in mid-rise character? So I'm here today as a resident of our neighborhood and a citizen like so many others in our city who live in Main Street areas, near existing transit stations, or in an area where there's a secondary plan that clearly states the maximum height for new developments. So I may be wrong and I may be confused. Are we all wrong? Are we all confused? Can official plans and secondary plans and community visions they reflect be swiped aside to build high rises on our main streets? As we near the finalization of the next official plan, I think we should know what plans mean. And it's certainly my hope and our hope that we encourage development that reflects the community's vision. And so that it's clear for developers when making their business plans, and it's clear for residents when they choose and we choose where to live. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Brian. Any questions from councillors? I want to ask a question, Brian, because over the last hour, I think we've kind of become buried in policy. Some policy is very objective and easy to apply. Some of it's more subjective. But I'm losing track of putting aside, I understand the community's argument around the consultation process and around the concerns with policy. The effect of quality of life from 12 stories versus 9 stories or even 6 stories, how would going to 12 stories affect the quality of life in your neighborhood? I'm struggling to understand that piece because that's not coming through today.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. What I would propose is that this building soars to 12 stories within 8 feet of the sidewalk, 2.8 meters. And that is not a human scale where people develop relationships. Certainly that works in downtown areas. And it's maybe not 12, but maybe as Councillor Leeper referred to, it's 18 and in a gateway area now. And so if the neighborhood gets transformed from 2 to 4 to 6 to 12 to 18, and all new buildings are that height, we essentially have a downtown and high rises in places that are main streets. those are not places that thrive. If we look at downtown Ottawa, for example, in the way people interact with their neighborhood, as I described, there are places in the city for both of those areas. But what I'm suggesting is that when the neighborhood comes together and agrees on what it's going to look like, and then we make decisions that go blatantly against that, it makes a mockery of what we've chosen to do, whether it's people who live here or people who choose to invest based on the rules that exist today.
Okay, thank you, Brian. We have another speaker on this. Jake Hanna is next.
Mute. Hello today, Council. Melody, I do believe you have a clip, and maybe we could start off with that. It sort of has my thoughts here. Just make sure volume's on. Thank you.
Economics aren't necessarily a part of the planning process, but you have to understand that these last two pieces of property were substantial costs associated with them, that people realized it was a really good idea to have them. Unfortunately, without moving from that 18 stories where we were, we really need to have at least some rationale on the evaluating, bring some value to the acquisition of these two properties. These two properties, who made up less than 1/4 of the site, I mean, probably close to 1/6 of the site, were valued at a huge number. It didn't make any sense at all economically to pick up these properties, but I think the benefits really outweighed the financial aspect of it. So we moved forward, or my client moved forward with the acquisition, really on the basis, hoping that we could pick up some extra density.
So my key and perhaps most salient point as being a resident is you go to an open house, and it was a rare insight into the world of development where the architect says the sole rationale for the height of this building is the expense of the land as we parceled it together. And that's been the driving force behind this project. And now all of our collective energy is amassed to try and rein in their economic prospects. So I'm asking you as a council, you have a job, you have a clear plan to follow, set the precedent by upholding that. And per Councillor Gower's point about what is the effect on the neighborhood, it's cynicism. It's political cynicism. As you can see, we are meeting and far exceeding the goals of density in this neighborhood 25 years from now. We're ahead of the curve. We don't need any more pressure here. And that's it. Any questions?
Thank you, Jake. Yes, there is a question. Councillor Leeper.
Thanks. And Jake, thanks for the video. I know the numbers that you presented demonstrate the level of intensification that we already have in Hintonburg. The secondary plan is a recognition of intensification. And it's a holistic look at how we're going to manage the impacts of that intensification by directing certain levels of height to certain areas. And this proposal comes in without a without a more comprehensive look at what does it mean when we start adding even more density to those areas, far beyond what the secondary plan calls for. What is the impact, besides cynicism, of much greater density beyond what is planned for, upsetting the apple cart in terms of the balance of, we're going to have some taller stuff here, we're going to keep it lower here. What is that impact on the whole sort of Hintonburg neighborhood when we're not adhering to the plans that are intended to guide and limit out of control growth?
Well, by no means am I an urban planner or anything like that. And I will say, actually, cynicism is probably one of the biggest problems, as this is a large development, but we're surrounded by smaller ones. And vis-a-vis, the meetings that you've had with residents around Innis Ward with not enough infrastructure, and your hands are kind of tied politically. You have to vote for the density on one side, but you kind of have to throw your existing residents under the bus because they can see that it's underserved. So I think it's a very clear and simple case. These people bundled up this land and they knew what the rules were before they bundled it. It's their problem. It's not the city's problem. It's not the council's problem. It's a very clear plan. Follow the plan. If our elected officials don't guide and staff doesn't guide everybody to the official plan, then we're stuck politically where your residents are putting in time and effort into the ether because the rules don't apply. I'm not the first resident that's spoken to that. Many have. And as we all know, over the summer, this particular committee had quite a bit of media light and attention put upon it because of some of its practices. So cynicism is the issue, and the density would represent, with no new services, no new community centers, no new parks, just an amendment to an existing city park that basically serves the building that is there. It becomes their gateway park. It's not in the collective interest, especially with the road closure. It's not an awful lot. It's not a big win for the neighborhood. It's just
Thanks,
not.
Jake.
Councillor Moffat.
No, I was going to ask a question, but it's not relevant. Thanks.
Oops. Thank you, Jake. That's the end of our questions from committee members. We're going to move to questions for the applicant. I'm going to ask Scott, can you just take over as chair for a few minutes?
Gladly. Right. So questions to the applicant. I believe Miguel's still here and Rod is still here.
Okay.
So if you have questions, you have to raise your hand so that I can draw attention to the person that has questions. Because as of right now, no one has their hand up. In which, oh, there we go. Councillor Dudas.
Sorry, I wasn't quick enough with the button there. I keep getting stuck, and I understand the 12 versus the 9. Maybe Rod, you can just explain to me why you wouldn't just go with the 9 stories. I mean, figure it out, work it into the plan, but adhere to the secondary plans that are in place right now. Because, once again, it sounds like this community had already, made a compromise back 3 years ago. It would have been an easy well, maybe not easy, but it would certainly be a conversation with them that they'd be more amenable to. So why not just 9?
If I could answer, it's a very good question. and recently we're doing a project at the other end of Wellington Street, Richmond Road, and same policies, and we are doing a 9-story building because of the nature of the immediate impact of that site in particular. The policies that are in place with regards to that site, but it just was the right thing to do. And we dealt with the transition. We did all those things that we're doing on this one. But this site really has some unique features to it. One, it's the entire block, which gives opportunities that don't normally exist. The other, which I think people are losing sight of, is this isn't, yes, it's has an edge, which is sort of part of the traditional Main Street, but this building fronts on now a park. So it has that distance that the traditional Main Streets are all about, as rightly put out, all about narrower streets and a very sort of vocabulary that speaks to a lower scale and that interaction between the pedestrian and the building. But this, because of one, you've got that angular movement of Wellington Street to Somerset Street. So that traditional Main Street sort of heads west along Somerset Street, and we're now separated by this park. And so by taking over the entire block allowed us to do some things that wouldn't normally could be done. And one of them was actually to close off all of Wellington Street. And, you know, it's been said, well, there's no benefit of that. And I think there's no benefit of that because people aren't realizing the potential of what that benefit could be. We could reimagine that park into something really unique and a real key feature to this part of the city. So there's real potential there. But more importantly, I think you view this site as it's a transitional site between that traditional Main Street and something greater. You know, it spoke to, you know, that we only have a 2 meter setback along Garland Street. Well, the current zoning actually on Garland Street is 0. So we actually moved our building back because we thought the current zoning of that 9-story building wasn't appropriate on a narrow street. So we increased the setback. You know, we created that cut through as a linking between the Armstrong House, create an animated street front. The idea that we've got this sort of, I call them almost sort of hidden spaces where you can walk down Wellington Street and sort of walk into this courtyard and discover something really interesting and through into Armstrong Street. So we're doing a lot of things where we began internally sort of transferring density from that 9-story up into the 12-story. But more importantly, I think the site's really got to be looked at differently. I would honestly say if I was the block immediately to the west of Garland Street, I wouldn't be looking at this type of height. I think the context would be totally different. So I think this site allows for some increased density in a way that does not adversely affect the community, I think, and you know, it helps support the goals of the overall city, and in a way that has minimal impact, whether it's a 9-story or 12-story. I think we spent a lot of attention to the detail, both on Wellington Street with the idea of these, you know, ground-orientated, neighborhood-friendly stores with direct access to now this expanded park area. So there's all sorts of opportunity on Armstrong Street. We're very careful to have, you know, landscape, 3-meter setback with trees and front yards to townhouses that are family orientated. So a lot of those things were done.
Rod, just for clarity, and I know Miguel has his hand up, so he probably wants to chime in, but I guess I'm wondering though, you're saying all of these amenities, attributes that are benefiting the community that you're looking to bring in couldn't have been achieved with a 9-story?
Well, I think sometimes you have to look at opportunities where you can increase density to help support city initiatives, and you sort of to not put it in almost would be wrong if there was a way to do it in a way that didn't have the impact. So I think the choices were made. You're right. You know, could you do a 9-story? Could you do a 6-story? But you begin to, you know, lose those potentials to have that increased density, which takes the pressure off everything being 9 stories. So
thank you.
Can I just add a little bit along the same lines? And I'd like to make 2 points in particular about the discomfort about secondary plan amendments. But you know, the developer initially started off with buying the 9-story portion of the building, and then and it's, I understand the discomfort of the most recent delegation for Jake about the bundling of properties, but it's actually a good thing from a planning perspective to acquire additional properties, to do a better job from an urban design perspective, from a massing perspective, from a distribution perspective. So if those additional lands wouldn't have been purchased, Rod wouldn't have been able to do, if you recall, townhouses fronting onto Armstrong and providing an appropriate transition. This is an amalgamation of an entire city block. It provides an opportunity to do something better, but it also came with an obligation to change some of these policy documents. You now have a city block that has 9 stories on a sliver at the corner, 6 stories in the middle, and the back portion isn't even part of the same policy document. It's a very fragmented approach, an illogical approach to applying policy to a design. What you want to do is say, we've acquired all of these lands, and we're now going to do the best building that we can. That building was different. We had different massing. We had considerably more height on this, but we worked with the UDRP, worked with staff, worked with the councillor's office and the community to reshape the building. And then we take that and we implement it through a secondary plan document. That's what the land bundling that Jake brought up allows us to do. It allows us to take a better approach to the design and reshape the policy documents. I'll make one last point related to why not, and Rod touched on it, why not 9? The city has to look at opportunities to increase density near transit. This is one rare traditional main street. I can only really think of a couple, including maybe the southern end of Preston Street and the northern end of Bank Street as you get closer to Parliament Station, where you overlap with direction related to transit. This is actually, we say 600 meters to transit. It's actually 340 meters to the center of that transit station. And it's going to be 600 meters to Corso Italia transit station. The Bayview station is the most important transit station in the city. It's the only intersection of both LRT lines. And for a portion of the Wellington West Main Street, it overlaps with those areas. So again, it's an opportunity for the city to say, you know what? We're going to rethink the policy documents. The question really to this committee is, are we doing it well? Is the building well designed to still integrate and meet the intent of the secondary plan policies? We have the mid-block connection. We have the 4-story transition. We do have the 2-story podium. Rod, in large part, chose to do it with materials. But to Rod's point, this is not a typical section of the Wellington Street Main Street. It's a dead-end road stub at the intersection of the geometry of Somerset and Wellington across the street from a park. So I know that some of the other projects had a more meaningful setback, but I would say it was less necessary in this case because of the location and the configuration of this site. And the last point I'll raise, if you allow me to, back to the community association, they said, listen, this is not a gateway site. The other sites were gateway sites. This is not a gateway site. You know what? Gateway has all these implied connotations. This is an important site that was consolidated into an entire city block, front, back, side to side on a traditional main street. A tremendous opportunity to do a modest, in my opinion, increase in height to get more density near transit. That's what's in front of committee today. So, thank you. That's it.
Thanks. Just on that, I would note that I think from the delegation's perspective, I think the notion of the neighborhood line, though, was not to have land assembly and not to have one community bleed into the other, because the neighborhood line was supposed to be a delineation between the fabric of the two different communities. So your land assembly sort of flies in the face of that. And I think that was the point they're making. So there's no question that there's a justification for what you're doing in terms of, from your perspective on the land assembly, but the other argument on the other side is based on that initial neighborhood line vision. That's I would say, I mean, so on that, I would actually ask you then, how do you see the intent of the neighborhood line, what that was based on in the secondary plan? Because it's pretty clear, neighborhood line is referenced many times. It does talk about that delineation between the lower rise Hintonburg community. How do you feel your application and pushing that neighborhood line respects the secondary plan?
So I'll make a couple of points, and the first one being more general, and I've had this discussion with Councillor Leeper on many occasions, in that it is impractical and unreasonable to assume that all the secondary plans in the city correctly identify opportunities and development scenarios on these properties. So I think this committee, and clearly, I think understands that there needs to be a certain level of flexibility in these policy documents when there is land assembly that creates opportunities to rethink these policy documents. It's well within the authority of this committee to do so. And sometimes you're going to have to revise policies related to height. Sometimes you're going to have to amend policies, in this case, also to the neighborhood line. What you have to do, though, is look at the intent of those policies. Amending a policy does not absolve you of the intent. And the intent was to have a very good transition to the low-rise fabric along Armstrong, and I think in particular to Armstrong House, which is an important community resource. And even Councillor Leeper and brought it up earlier that there is a transition. There's a transfer of building materials. There's a transfer of building profiles to a maximum of 4 stories for the the podium in the rear. Rather than have back of house, it actually has street fronting townhouse units to recognize the fabric along Armstrong. So I'm comfortable with the official plan amendment to move the neighborhood line in large part because of the successes of the urban design approach.
Well, we know you're comfortable, Miguel. You're the applicant.
Well, I would.
But I'm also
the existing zoning,
this committee.
Sorry, if I could just note that the existing zoning, actually the 9-story portion of the site, actually dealt with that in a way so that the consistency of that neighborhood line was broken both on Garland and if you look on Hilda Street, where basically the parking lot for the building, the 9-story building on Hilda Street is basically there. So that the fabric in this area gets about that neighborhood line has already sort of been disturbed, as we say. And so architecturally, we responded to it by actually doing what we've done, which is creating a very residential frontage to our project along Armstrong Street to reinforce that idea that Armstrong Street is very different than Wellington Street, both in scale and use. So.
Thanks, Rod. Any other questions for the applicant on this? I don't see any. So we will move on, and we will move on to questions to staff. And Councillor Hughley's up first.
Thank you, Chair Moffat. I appreciate the opportunity. I just have a simple question I'd like to probably direct best to legal on this. We've heard a lot of questions here regarding what we can do and how we can interpret the plans and so on. I think, kudos to Councillor Leeper for putting forward a good question on this one for us to consider. Could, Mr. Mark, I apologize in advance for putting you on the spot here, but it really is a key question for me on this. What's our chances in front of the LPAT when you have to, like obviously you have a staff report that's supporting this, but this difference of the 3 stories here, how's that going to play, or how do you see that playing when you get before the tribunal?
Mr. Chair, it is true that when an applicant has either counsel or staff with them on a matter before the tribunal, they are much more likely to succeed than not. So if staff recommend refusal and council adopts, or if staff recommend approval but council turns it down, the applicant typically does have a much better than 50% success rate. In the circumstances of this, it would be the references to policy that have been made by those opposed to the development, as against some of the comments that have been made by the applicants and staff that favor the development. But in generalities, much more likely to succeed than not, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Mark. I appreciate your honesty here. My next question would be to probably Doug James is, again, referring to Councillor Leeper's proposal. He makes a good point about the setback going up. I think it's the fourth story. He wanted to see more of a setback. I think the existing one is 0.8. Mr. James, was there any discussion on staff's part with trying to achieve a better setback in this application, and why not?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Actually, the applicant in previous proposal before the ones before committee didn't have a step back there. The secondary plan calls for one at the second or third story. So we got the step back. I think you're referring to the one along Wellington Street, because it is step back is 4 in the back, which mimics the low-rise residential to the north. But in order to create a predominant podium, and as presented by the applicant, there is a bit of a step back there, and they also have different materiality on the ground floor, which helps create animation, help define that podium level at the second story, and having windows and doors at the ground floor also will help create that podium. So all those things together, and even though it's just almost a meter for the bottom 2 stories, we believe from a planning perspective, it met the intent of that policy.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the answers.
Thanks. I will just say on the first question that you had there, I've probably said this before. I don't think this committee, I've always felt this committee council should never be making decisions based on whether an applicant's going to appeal. Who cares? Ultimately, we have to make a good decision, right? But apropos of nothing, I also think that I've never looked into this, but I do think that when the community appeals a city decision, the success rate is better than when council goes against a staff recommendation based on city policy. Again,
Can I respond to that, Chair?
Yeah, no, it is. I was
just briefly. I guess maybe I should have been more clear in how I put the question to him. What I was looking for was a sense of if legal thought we were building a very good case here to support the staff position, or has there been information that came out here today that would cause legal concerns with us going forward with what had been proposed coming into the meeting. So I was trying to get a professional view, and that's why I had a question for the planners as well as legal. But I agree with you. We shouldn't be making decisions solely based on what's our chances at LPAT.
Yeah, and it's probably unfair of me to stick that onto your comment, because it's made by we hear it often, right? We heard it on Herongate. We hear it on a lot of things based on is someone going to appeal or not? So it wasn't exclusive to any one comment. It's just in general, it does come up often, and we should always try to avoid making decisions based on who or what is going to appeal. So moving on, Councillor Chair Gower.
Thank you, Councillor Chair Moffat. I made a number of notes from the delegations in the conversation so far. So I want to go through a few of these for clarity. There was a question about the solar panels and the shadow study. Staff, will those solar panels be blocked by this new building? And should that be part of our consideration of the zoning change today?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I did actually incorporate the sun shadow study in my slides. I just didn't go to it. If Melody could be so kind as to load it up. And it's slide 19 of the deck, but I'll start. Oh, thank you. So it's a little blurry, but if we look at the corner of Wellington Street West and Hilda, the property that I believe Ms. Parrott pointed out is immediately there. It's that tall building, and you can see the various points in the sun shadow study through the year. and times that reflect it. And based on my reading of the study, the majority of the roof is unfazed and unimpacted by this new proposal and its shadows that are projected.
So
I apologize, I don't have control to point out the specific building, but it's, again, if we look at the corner of Wellington Street West and Hilda, it's a building immediately to the east.
So there are certain times of the day during part of the year where there could be a shadow on those solar panels.
Yeah, we're seeing it largely in December. And again, through March, June, September, again, my reading of the plan is that it's largely unaffected.
So maybe a question for Mr. Mark, who I think has advised our committee before, there's no legal right to sunlight. What happens if a new building blocks an existing solar panel installation, even if it's only for part of the day, part of the year? Is there any legal ruling on that?
So, Mr. Chair, that is something I have been watching for in case law, because with the increasing emphasis to green energy, it has occurred to me that this is going to become an issue. And I have, there was a case where this was, where it was brought up with respect to the north part of Roosevelt, but it was by no means a deciding factor in the case. I expect it to arise, but I have not come across a decision yet, Mr. Chair.
I think it's a matter, it probably needs to be negotiated, discussed, mitigated between the two building owners. From Simon, are you aware if there's been any discussion between the owners on that?
I believe this specific property just came up recently as of today with their comments on shadowing, and I can speak that the applicant has in fact met with other residents in the area who have had similar concerns on potential shadowing impacts. I think the first thing is to understand, physically in a plan and study, is there an impact, yes or no? And then how can the building be modified or adjusted to potentially reduce that impact? But we are in the absence of any specific criteria to measure sun impacts or shadowing impacts.
Okay.
And
I just noticed Doug has his hand up, so I figured it's not to ask staff questions. So go ahead, Doug.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think it might be a question for the applicant, but it's my understanding that they have recently met to discuss this issue with the neighbors next door, and it has been resolved. But as I said, it might be a question more for, that's my understanding anyway, but a question for the applicant.
On the size of the lot, I mean, I know they're allowed to assemble a parcel of land by purchasing more and more land, but I guess my question is, what factor the size of lot have in staff evaluating the appropriateness of more than 6 stories or more than 9 stories?
Thank you. Honestly, it had very little. I mean, I don't disagree with Mr. Tremblay that consolidating an entire block creates a unique opportunity. It certainly helps in being able to design a building comprehensive movements that are required, such as transition and setbacks and stepbacks. But we've as a fact, we dealt with a similar application in 2018. That was only a portion of the lands, and we made a land use planning recommendation. So it was not a predominant factor.
Okay.
If I just going to add a little bit, but it does allow the opportunity on a bigger site to provide the transition in relation to the policies, as Simon had mentioned. You have that better opportunity to do so, and you have that opportunity to have a building that on a bigger lot that could fit in better with the surrounding community. And so it does afford an opportunity for consideration in this case of a 12-story building because it does meet those policies with respect to intensification and compatibility in design.
A more general question about secondary plans. So we kind of heard a range of opinions from residents and from the delegations on the intersection of secondary plans and the official plan. There were some residents, I think, who seemed to express that secondary plans should not be touched at all. I think Christy Ross gave a bit more nuance to that there are mechanisms within the secondary plan and the official plan that allow for reconsideration or amendments. I want to hear from staff, though. You believe the official plan and the secondary plan, it's appropriate for the applicant to seek an amendment, and you believe this is checked off the boxes in terms of the conditions of the official plan that allow for an amendment here. Can you just outline clearly for us, you did it a little bit in your presentation, Simon, but again, what are the key factors that you believe make this amendment acceptable?
Go ahead,
Thank you.
Simon. Let you start.
Sorry. Thanks. On the ability to assess the application and hear the application, yes, it's our recommendation that the application meets that policy direction for the reconsideration of a secondary plan and to consider an amendment. We very often see amendments to secondary plans. It is not a new application or process that have been before this planning committee and previous planning committee. So that fundamental ability to re-examine them has been done and is something that can be done in this circumstance. I don't entirely agree, excuse me, with Ms. Ross about the mechanism and that test in the OP about the comprehensiveness, because we're not dealing with the amendment to the entire secondary plan. It's a site-specific process, and to my knowledge, we've never executed or enacted that level of detail that she was suggesting in reviewing an application. We follow our city's consultation processes that the public has certainly been involved in, but I think it's within our ability and purview to assess the application. On the policy direction, it's fundamentally within a site that is located in proximity to transit. And that in itself is not enough to just say you're allowed to have a taller building. The next step to that, and I think Rod and the team and myself have taken you through the design narrative and expectations that are expected through the policy to look at matters such as transition, shadowing, public realm, and articulation of the building. And those two key factors, the policy direction to be located in transit and the design considerations to achieve compatibility, are the fundamental drivers in being able to support this application.
Christy Ross asserted that there's already a mechanism in the secondary plan to allow for height increase on Wellington, but only from 6 stories to 9 stories. Was that not correct, or is there another policy or something else that would supersede that?
Thank you. She is correct. There's the policy regime that identifies certain sites in the Somerset Square Policy District that could go up to 9, but this request is to go to that next level and introduce a modest increase of an additional 3 stories that puts us into the planning language of a high-rise building. So we have to go back to those parent OP policies that give us direction on how to assess that. But she's not incorrect that yes, there are areas that can see up to 9 stories.
But it is, if I may, important to consider that when you turn to the new official or to the current official plan and the primary plan, it does give us that direction to be able to amend the secondary plan. We always amend secondary plans. I can think of, just made a list here of 15 that have either just come to committee recently or will be coming before the end of the year. So it's not abnormal to amend a secondary plan. And you take a look at those policies in the primary plan. And again, it comes down to design, compatibility, and how it fits in. Without going through the details, with 45-degree angle, the setbacks, the step backs, the podium, the creating of windows and doors on the ground floor, of a public realm, that it does fit within those policies, and we consider it to be appropriate in this case to go to that 12 stories.
Okay, I guess as I mentioned earlier, I think when we're looking at secondary plan amendments or OPA amendments, there's some things that are really easy to measure against. There are other things that are more subjective. So I think ultimately what we're deciding on the committee is whether or not staff have appropriately assessed and their recommendations reflect what's appropriate on the subjective items. So thanks to Thanks to the delegations earlier, and thanks to staff for your answers. Thanks, Chair, Councillor.
Thanks. I'll just move on to Councillor Tierney, and then I'll rescind the chair back to my colleague, Glenn.
Thank you, chairs. I'll keep it brief. Actually, a question. Thanks, Simon, and thanks, Doug James. I think it just got answered by Chair Gower asking the question, what is leading to the staff supporting this? And the transit certainly is a component. Obviously, is that if this would have been right up to the edge of the TOD region, that obviously that still would make this building possible, but it is only what, 600 meters? It's pretty close, right?
Thank you. I think we heard that the site is approximately 350 meters from the Bayview station.
Okay. Okay, great. No, that's all. Thank you very much. Thanks for the clarification. Appreciate it.
Who's in charge, Scott, you or me?
I rescinded it. I gave it back to you.
Oh, okay. Okay. Musical chairs.
Oh, this co-chair thing is just not working. No.
Councillor Kitts.
Thank you, both co-chairs. With respect to a maximum of 9 stories on traditional main streets, why 9 stories? I guess what I'm looking for is, you know, why was that decided to be the right height for a traditional main street?
Whoops. I'm going to say, if you take a look at our policy regime, 1 to 4 is low rise, and then 5 to 9 is mid rise. So it was probably chosen because it was the top of a mid rise category of building as defined within, well, the zoning bylaw as well, but the official plan.
So then, with respect to going from 9 to 12, it's not so much the stories, it's more that it's just in one bucket as opposed to the next bucket.
It is in another bucket. Yes, Mr. Chair, it is in another bucket. But then again, you have to consider, if you go from 9 to 12, how's the compatibility of that development? How does that development fit in with the surrounding area? And that's what the staff report says, and that's why we recommend approval. And you look at the compatibility policies, the design policies, that when you consider going from 9 to 12, it is our opinion that they satisfy those. Therefore, it is appropriate to add those extra 3 stories.
Okay. Okay. And then I found the conversation around the neighborhood line quite interesting. So is there any assurances that we can make to the community that this line won't continue to move?
Thank you for the question. I think Miguel Tremblay kind of took you through that a little bit, and as well in my presentation, that it is a very unique circumstance in that we have a collection of parcels that they're already fragmented in administration and zoning and secondary plan boundaries. So the property furthest to the west had already kind of broken through and set that stage for creating a uniform policy regime. So fundamentally, yes, the neighborhood line is changing for this application. The design intent and planned function for it is still being maintained, in our opinion, for a low profile development at 4 stories, and Rod Leahy took you through that. I can't speak to future applications, but I did want to explore that question a little more, and I took the time to speak with the author of the secondary plan to better understand what she was thinking in that circumstance with that policy direction. And I think there's an application of that in other areas of the Scott Street secondary plan where you've got specific sites for tall buildings already, and some person was able to acquire more lands and create a longer parcel and then extend that neighborhood line to allow for taller development. That's kind of the intent of that policy, and not allowing for that creep. Here, we're fundamentally amending those 2 secondary plans, but maintaining that intent of a low profile development. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. I was going to use my time to wrap up as well, but I have a dog barking here, so I will get back on the the list. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Chair Moffat.
Thank you. I think ultimately, I think the question I had before, which was about the sections, I think that's been fairly well covered in the other discussion from other members of council. I do just want to pass on one thing. During Councillor Gower's questioning of staff, spoke about the impacts on the neighboring property. So in that time, I did reach out because a hand went up in the waiting room, and instead of bringing them back in, I just sent them an email. So it was from Maureen Flanagan, who is with the applicant, and she just indicated that they are in continuous discussions with Unity Housing regarding the shadowing study, and she'll be following up with them following today's meeting regarding a virtual review of that study. So they are still working on that aspect, and just in response to Councillor Gower's question earlier.
Okay, thanks, Councillor. I'll try to buy a bit of time for Catherine Kitts. I wanted to mention just one of my pet peeves when we're talking about proximity to transit. It may be 350 meters if you're traveling by jetpack, but I think the walk is a bit more indirect. It's probably more like 500 or 600 meters, but Councillor Leeper would know better than any of us. And Councillor, you have your hand up, so we'll go to you, Councillor Leeper.
Thanks. And I don't have questions for staff. I mean, clearly we disagree on some of the interpretations in the report. Staff have suggested that a 0.8 meter setback on Wellington Street before going up to 9 is an appropriate expression of a low-rise podium. I disagree, and the community disagrees as well. But just to, I guess, wrap it up, I very much enjoyed the discussion today, and I think you've seen that it's been different from some of the controversial developments that come to us every couple of weeks. Today's presentation and delegations by the community were focused. They were absolutely policy-based. And we have a fundamental disagreement in terms of what does the official plan allow. And obviously I side with Ms. Ross. The official plan speaks to greater density near transit and to the fact that we're going to constrain what that density looks like according to the particular context of the neighborhood with secondary plans. And then if we're contemplating amending secondary plans, there are criteria that we should be applying to those. It's not open season on secondary plans. We have two relatively new secondary plans that contemplate the arrival of LRT. They were done in the full knowledge that the arrival of Corso Italia Station, Bayview Station, Tunney's Pasture Station were going to bring significant intensification pressures to this neighborhood. And you've seen the density in Jake's video that is contemplated in this neighborhood. And council's intent was to guide and constrain what that growth looks like while still meeting the city's growth objectives. We don't need to approve this building to achieve the city's growth objectives. There are deliberate constraints that are put on it. And much of this is a matter of black letter law. I apologize to the lawyers in the room, Mr. Mark, for the analogy, but I believe it's pretty black letter. The policies are explicit and clear. And to speak to Councillor, I believe Gower or Moffat, I cannot remember which, asked about the precedents at the OMB. It wasn't that long ago that the Ontario Municipal Board ruled in the case of the Roosevelt development proposed by Uniform that secondary plans mean what they say. Community design plans mean what they say. And I'm going to assume that the tribunal, when it has the clear policies in black and white in the official plan in front of it, are going to again make the same decision if that moves forward. We have a responsibility, and Councillor Moffat has been talking a lot about this today. He and I have had a number of good discussions over the past couple of days. We have a responsibility to clearly outline the policy basis for going with official plan amendments and with secondary plan amendments. And in this case, The amendment is being justified, I believe, largely on the basis that it's close to transit. When the council and planning staff crafted the Scott Street Secondary Plan and Wellington West Secondary Plan, they knew that transit was going to come. And they said, there's going to be a transition. We're going to have very tall buildings on the spine of the O train and of the Confederation line. That's going to move down into mid-rise buildings near our traditional main street. That's going to transition down into the neighborhoods. And here's the line. Here's the line in which we're going to continue to have low-rise intensification. You saw in Cheryl Parrott's presentation the extensive amount of low-rise that's happening, and we're going to have mid-rise intensification. And in some special cases, we're going to be allowed to go to 9 stories. I don't believe that the policy rationale set out in our official plan has been met to justify approving this proposal. And I do want to be very clear on what the implications are with respect to us as politicians around this table trying to pass a new official plan that contemplates significant new intensification. We've told residents, yes, the new official plan is going to allow heights up to 4 stories in our neighborhoods. It's going to allow heights up to 4 stories in our traditional main streets, but don't worry, we're going to go through an exercise of constraining those according to the specific context in which we're contemplating it. If this passes, I'm going to have a very difficult time telling residents that the new official plan is not going to be the Wild West, that there are going to be appropriate constraints on height and density according to geographic context. It makes it difficult for me to overcome the cynicism that you heard Jake talk about in his. So I would ask you to side with the residents. I would ask you to contemplate and think about the really clear, solid policy rationale that Ms. Ross has provided us for refusing this application, and to vote accordingly. I'll leave it there. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor. Anyone else on wrap up? Okay. Well, let's do yays and nays. Melody?
Councillor Judas.
No.
Councillor Suds. Councillor Tierney.
Yes.
Councillor Leeper.
No.
Councillor Brockington.
Yes.
Councillor Menard.
No.
Councillor Cloutier.
Yes.
Councillor Kitts.
Yes.
Councillor Hughley.
Yes.
Councillor El-Shantiri.
Yes.
Chair Moffat.
Yeah.
Chair Gower.
Yes.
8-3. Sorry, yes, 8-3.
Okay, 8-3 in the report recommendations carry. We're almost done. I just want to go back on a procedural item. The vote we made on item number 1. Melody, can you just state the final vote tally for that again for us?
Yes, my apologies. My eyes weren't reading what I had written. It was 9-2, and I can read those out if you like.
I think that's fine. Thank you. There are no in-camera items today. Are there any notices of motion for consideration at a subsequent meeting? Seeing none. Any inquiries? Any other business? All right, then we are adjourned. Our next meeting is Thursday, September 23rd. And thank you again, Melody, and best of luck with whatever comes next for you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Melody.
Thank you, Melody.
Thanks, Melody.
Take care, all.
All the best, Melody.
Thanks, Mel.
Thank you, Melody.